I've had a strange, pun absolutely intended, relationship with Star Trek Strange New Worlds ever since it premiered back in 2022. Dear God, time really does fly when you're watching the world burn. Discovery had finally yeeted itself 1,000 years into the future, breaking the franchise's decade-long prequel addiction. Star Trek Picard, which was messy, yes, at least tried to do something new with legacy characters like Seven of Nine and Jean-Luc instead of embalming them in nostalgia formaldehyde, and actually added some new characters and ideas to the franchise. Again, not in the best way, but you know, it was trying its best.
That's been clear to both of us for some time now, I imagine. Going forward, it would all be too awkward.
Star Trek Prodigy was also a solid on-ramp for kids and secretly one of the best Star Trek show in ages, and Lower Decks was Trek at its funniest and weirdest, which is what I love about it.
It's naked time!
It was basically Gene Roddenberry's horniest fever dream finally sanctioned by Viacom CBS. And so, when Strange New Worlds came out, Season 1, amidst all of that, felt like a refreshing return to episodic storytelling in an era obsessed with serialization. But it didn't just recycle the old 1960s or 1990s format, it updated it. Legacy characters like Pike and Number One, previously about as fleshed out as background NPCs in a side quest in a video game, suddenly had inner lives. New characters like La'an and Hemmer brought us fresh energy. Even Spock, already the most overexposed character in Star Trek, trotted out so often that he's basically become the franchise equivalent of the McDonald's McRib, was given new dimensions in the show. And the series actually seemed to want to say something about today. Una's arc, for example, with her worrying about being accepted only if she was one of the good ones, spoke directly to the experiences of marginalized people being tokenized.
What would you do if I wasn't a hero? One of the good ones? When will it be enough to just be an Illyrian?
It felt like past Trek recontextualized for the present day. Trek with its brain still switched on.
Brain and brain, what is brain?
Season 2, though, started to feel like someone had begun to... So I'm filming this in my garage, and my fiance literally just opened the garage and tried to park the car forgetting that I was filming in here today. So that was funny. Anyways, its Season 2 was a little bit shakier. We got episodes like Ad Aspera Per Aspera, one of modern Trek's best, that directly tackled unjust laws and institutionalized prejudice. The Lower Decks crossover episode was also smarter than it had any right to be, reminding us that the great men of history are also just messy people fumbling forward and trying to figure it out.
Sometimes it's hard to visit the past.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to be here at all.
But the lows also hit really hard as well. Mbenga suddenly had a super soldier serum, Ortegas' long-teased focus episode boiled down to she's just happy flying the ship, and the big musical episode ended on a hymn to conformity.
We know our purpose is to protect the mission.
We all know our roles, and our role is the mission. Which sounds less like Starfleet and more like my high school guidance counselor. And then there was the gore. We'll get to the Gorn. But then came the long hiatus, thanks to the writers and actor strikes of 2023. And by the time Strange New Worlds returned this year, Trek itself had changed. Discovery, Picard, Lower Decks, and Prodigy were all either wrapped up or canceled, and suddenly Strange New Worlds wasn't just a Trek show, it was the Trek show, the flagship, with only Starfleet Academy on the horizon. And I guess Star Trek Scouts if you count that.
Discover, grow, boldly go!
And the message of Trek of this era also seemed to be getting less bold than even a few years earlier. Star Trek Picard's third season leaned so far into nostalgia it dislocated its shoulder, dragging the Enterprise D out of mothballs just to reset the crew into their old patterns and save the galaxy from a Borg woke mind virus infecting the youth. And again, not knocking you if you like that season, there were things to like about the season, but it did have its nostalgia problems, especially at the end.
We are the cavalry.
The Section 31 movie, though, was less mixed than that. It looked less like a critique of Starfleet's dark side and more like a CIA coup fanfiction starring Michelle Yeoh.
Starfleet, where fun goes to die.
Which brings us finally to Strange New Worlds Season 3. And yeah, it was a deeply depressing disappointment. The spark that made Season 1 feel exciting feels gone. In its place, we got endless romance subplots, some problematic biological essentialism, and glossy nostalgia chanting, "We love Star Trek!" without ever asking what Star Trek is for right now. And all of this is happening while Paramount, the studio that owns Star Trek, is being sold off to Skydance, a company that is happily cozying up to authoritarian politics. So when Strange New Worlds strips Star Trek of its politics and hopes for the future, it doesn't feel like a letdown, it feels more like a warning sign of our current media ecosystem. A symptom of how easily we give up not just our stories for tomorrow, but our ability to even dream one up. The sheen of an apolitical Star Trek isn't neutral, but a reflection of the same empty civility that props up Gavin Newsom as the answer to the fight against fascism, or eulogizes Charlie Kirk as simply a man who wanted earnest debate while erasing the violence that he preached. Strange New Worlds' blandness isn't just corporate, but ideological, an echo of a culture that mistakes avoiding conflict for peace. And when we call that centrism balance, we're really just watching power pick a side while pretending it hasn't. Which is kind of a problem when your whole franchise's catchphrase is, "Boldly go." I know I do cosplays for most of my videos, but every so often you put it on and you just go, yeah, I rock this. Anyways, one of the biggest problems with Strange New Worlds this season is that it treats genre as an end in and of itself rather than a tool to tell something bigger. Star Trek has always used tropes and formats. I mean, we've had baseball games, courtroom dramas, Flash Gordon riffs, and whatever that gothic horror sex ghost was.
Have trust in me.
You're not Nana. Nana's dead. Leave her alone!
But at its best, those were vehicles to explore deeper questions and themes about justice, morality, or what happens when you put Worf in a baseball uniform.
Strike three!
Here on Strange New Worlds, though, the homage often seems like it's the point in and of itself. Less exploring Strange New Worlds and more, remember that thing that you liked? Well, here it is again with a Star Trek coat of paint. Take episode 3 of this season, Shuttle to Kinfori. It's basically, what if we did The Last of Us in Star Trek? Fungus zombies and Pedro Pascal are trendy, let's slap some ridges on them and call it a day. The zombie's not Pedro Pascal, though I would like a Pedro Pascal Klingon, that would be fun. Give him the whole boob window thing, it would be great. And look, if Trek can make Jack the Ripper a space ghost, it can absolutely do zombies. The problem is that in this story, the zombies, like Crackers and Farscape, don't matter. They're just set dressing for Pike to fret about his girlfriend, M'Benga to have a plot about his extrajudicial murder of a war criminal Klingon ambassador, and Ortegas to wrestle with the PTSD that the writers decided to saddle her with this season. None of those arcs grow out of the actual zombie plot of the episode, or even really connect to it all that much. The writers don't even seem to be interested in the zombies for their own sake. They're supposed to be fungus zombies, but they act like any generic undead. At least when Star Trek Enterprise did zombies, the Vulcan ones there went full 28 days later rage virus. And that episode isn't exactly a classic, as most of Star Trek Enterprise isn't, but the zombies in that story actually mattered. They fed into not only the story of the episode, but also the season-long plot and character arcs. The NX-01 literally had to coat its hull with Trellium that they found from the Vulcan ship so they could survive in the Expanse and look for Space Al-Qaeda, which later left the Vulcan T'Pol hooked on it like it was space crack.
Is there anyone out there who still isn't clear about what doing drugs does? Okay, last time. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
But here in Shuttle to Kinfori, the zombies are just kinda here. And this seems to be the overriding ethos of the entire season now. As Pike actor Anson Mount explained about showrunner Akiva Goldsman's approach to episode pitches for the show,
Akiva's mantra continues to be, Star Trek can be a lot of things, so we're not just playing with the message that can be told, but with the episodic structure, we can play with how we get there.
And sure, back in the day, with 22 episodes a season, a one-off homage episode felt like a fun detour. But with only 10 episodes given to us every year and a half at this point, each one kinda has to count. And it would be fine if one of those episodes turned out to be a gimmick, but too often though, the show seems to start from pitching a gimmick or trope rather than a character or idea, leaving the show just generally feeling adrift. But to be clear, even playing with genre could still work if it dug into Trek's core ethos, like Anson Mount says Akiva Goldsman is doing, digging into ideas of diversity, curiosity, empathy, discovery. But more often than not, it feels like the writers are just excited that they get to cosplay their favorite genre for a week, because most of the episode plots just seem to skim the surface and hit the expected beats and then just collapse into cliches. Let's take episode 2 of this year, Wedding Bell Blues. It's basically the writers going, well, what if we got to do a Q episode from The Next Generation?
And I do not like it when people ruin my plans.
Except, instead of everyone's favorite chaotic gay space imp John Delancey showing up naked to torment his French boyfriend, we instead get the equally delightful Rhys Darby here messing with Spock.
Something different, but better? Something you definitely want?
He literally bottles Spock up at one point, which is peak space god energy. Brainiac would be proud. But the difference is that Q often wasn't just there on the Enterprise to make the crew LARP as Robin Hood, but to challenge them in thematically resonant ways. He would put humanity on trial in the first episode of the show, he would humble Picard with the Borg, and often asked if we humans were even ready to go to the stars.
If you can take a little bloody nose, maybe you ought to go back home and crawl under your bed. It's not safe out here. It's wondrous, with treasures to satiate desires both subtle and gross. But it's not for the timid.
But in this episode, Darby is mostly here to prop up a rom-com plot where Spock's big arc is to get over Chapel, who dumped him last episode and is already with a new guy named Corby after a 3-month time jump. And yes, it is that Corby, the guy that Chapel later gets engaged to in the original series before he went on to discover a planet of penis-shaped rocks and a sex bot assembly line, because it was the 60s. Credit where it's due though, Strange New Worlds finally gave us a character with an Irish accent in Star Trek that they didn't immediately saddle with racist nonsense. You'd think this wouldn't need to be a compliment in 2025, but after the Section 31 movie...
I heard as soon as I said it.
I will kick your ass until you cannot form a solid mass of...
Buzz, buck it down.
It's not Star Trek unless it's being weird about the Irish. Let's just say Cole Meany probably is looming over the writer's room like, try Leprechaun and I will haunt you. Anyways, the plot of this episode is fine, but it never really goes deeper than Spock's sad, space hijinks ensue. Darby plays a space puck, granting Spock's wish with a monkey's paw into a wedding comedy cliche that would make Shakespeare groan.
How do we feel about pomegranate?
I do not need a bacchanal.
Then you should get your beauty rest.
I do not need to sleep.
Count tribbles then.
Darby's bits are funny, but that's all they are. Bits. There's no thematic meat here to this episode, just surface level antics to wrap up the Spock Chapel subplot and let Darby riff. And yes, I hear you nerds out there yelling Trelane at the screen, don't worry, we will get there. But while it's disappointing for any Star Trek show to shy away from larger ideas, Strange New Worlds' refusal to interrogate what its stories are saying points to a deeper problem. When the focus becomes on replicating genres for fun rather than exploring themes, the result isn't just empty, it defaults to reinforcing the cultural norms we already treat as natural. Strange New Worlds ends up projecting today's norms into tomorrow instead of doing what Star Trek has always done at its best. Challenge the present by imagining a future where we've actually tried to grow beyond it. Take how in Wedding Bell Blues, the episode centers almost entirely on Spock's point of view, reducing Chapel, supposedly a main character of the show, to little more than an object passed between him and Corby. Her mind is literally magicked into loving Spock so the men can fight over her.
She kissed me.
But the worst part for me is how abruptly the show tries to sell us on Chapel falling in love with Corby before Darby even shows up. Apparently, she fell in love with him because he read her a poem and was vaguely romantic for 3 months. Oh, and he was technically her boss during that time, but we're not going to talk about that. No. To be clear, the issue isn't the speed of their romance. If anyone knows lesbians, we all know that relationships can come and go pretty quickly. It's the emptiness of it. Nothing about their relationship feels distinct to how Chapel has been set up as a character within this show. Sure, love poems can be romantic. I myself wrote a few of them back in college. Don't worry, those notebooks met a fiery end. But here, it's just cliche, not something that reveals anything about who she is. Instead, the scene where we talk about the poem that Chapel apparently fell in love with Corby over exists solely to make Spock squirm in a bland comedy bit. As if the writer's room just went, poems! Women like those things, right?
And give her this.
Talarian star gems.
They're incredibly rare.
Yeah.
It makes no sense for this version of Chapel. We've already seen her push back against long-term commitments and roll her eyes at big romantic gestures in this show. The episode Spock Amok basically framed her as a total hot mess, and girl, same.
It was one time.
One very entertaining time.
How is being chased by live phaser fire fun?
That glorious messiness, paired with Jess Bush's infectiously joyous performance, made her one of Season 1's standout characters and honestly one of my favorites. Now though, she's been sanded down into something closer to the original series' version of Chapel, who mostly just hung around mooning over Spock like she was waiting for a text that was never going to come.
I love you. I don't know why, but I love you. I do love you. Just as you are. Oh, I love you.
Sorry.
Even the actress who played her, Majel Barrett herself, called that version of the character a loser, openly mocking how shallow and sexist the writing was, specifically even calling out the episode with Corby in it.
I really felt sorry for her. I never really thought too much of her. I felt she was a weakling and she probably deserved what she got. She was a doctor to start with. And in order to go out and find her fiancé, she accepts a position on board this starship at a reduction in rank and a reduction in salary, of course. Signs on as a nurse because they already have the doctor, and off they go. She finds her fiancé, who turns out to be an android. Well, he's not going to do her any good. Right. So she immediately signs back on this ship again for a 5-year mission, again at a reduced in rank and pay, and immediately falls in love with a Vulcan who only comes in heat once every 7 years. Now, this woman's a loser.
Apparently, the only reason that Majel Barrett agreed to play Chapel was because she wanted a job, and also because she wanted to stay on Star Trek after her original character, number 1, was cut from the series. And if we're being honest, it was also because she was fucking Gene Roddenberry, who was then married to another woman at that point, in an apartment near the Desilu lot. Which, you know, shame on Gene Roddenberry, but good for her. And yet, here we are 60 years later reheating the same storyline because it reminds us that Chapel's supposed to end up with Corby. Jess Bush's Chapel now just vaguely falls in love again and is reduced to an artifact for Spock's growth. Indeed, the whole episode just defaults to the most traditional heteronormative plot I've ever seen, complete with stereotypical romance and a Judeo-Christian marriage ceremony presented as the natural climactic endpoint for the relationship, even though neither character, even Spock, ever expressed wanting that. It's simply assumed that this is what his dream wish would result in, because the story isn't interested in making them feel unique, it just wants the rom-com beats. I mean, at the very least, if this was Spock's wish, wouldn't it be a Vulcan wedding ceremony, not a human one? The result is just a cliche character arc that's just recycling tired, objectifying tropes that were already outdated in the 60s instead of saying anything new. Which, speaking of, brings me to this season's endless romantic subplots. Chapel suddenly falls in love with Corby, Uhura gets paired off with Ortegas' brother, and much of Pike's arc this season revolves around Patel. Even Una is revealed to have a long-lost Vulcan lover, played by Patton Oswalt no less, and Spock, well, Spock, I guess, is cycling through everyone at this point, like Pon farr happens every 7 days instead of every 7 years. When did this turn into Star Trek Love Boat all of a sudden?
Love, exciting and new. Come aboard, expecting you and love. Life's sweetest reward.
And again, this could work, but none of these relationships are written with any specificity. Corby and Chapel hook off entirely off screen, Uhura and Beto are giving each other take me now eyes the second that they meet, and Spock and Lon are suddenly making out 2 episodes after Spock gets over Chapel, despite having shown no romantic chemistry before that point. Hell, Lon doesn't even spend most of that episode with the real Spock, but with a serial killer hologram version of him. Which, you know, not to kink shame, but girl. And I can almost swear that that relationship only happened because the actors are reportedly dating. They even dropped a music single together.
Put it on the screen.
I wonder how to trust you.
Baby, set me out before. Take me to Tijuana.
Of the earth in the land of Shire lives a brave little hobbit whom we all admire.
But just because you're harmonizing on Spotify doesn't mean your characters need to hook up at Warp 9. None of these romances have any build-up, any yearning to them. It's just, well, guess they're a couple now. Where's the juice, the slow-burning ache, hell, even just basic chemistry? I'm not a big fan of romance plots in general, but like, that's the whole point of why you do them, to see that shit. Not just, oh, I guess they're banging now. Instead, everyone just acts like horny, angsty teenagers with stock 1990s outdated rom-com problems. Una spends half an episode swooning over Vulcan Patton Oswalt, which also, by the way, lands like the sexist, how could a guy like this get a girl like Rebecca fucking Romaine joke. But she's also written like she literally can't control herself, roping in Spock to pretend that they're married with 2 kids in a sitcom gag that makes the first officer of the Enterprise look like she wandered into a bad CW pilot.
We got married and we're in love and we got married and he has a Lurpa. A big Lurpa.
In that same episode, La'an childishly pushes Spock away because he leaves his socks in her room? And she doesn't know if she can handle a committed relationship because of it? Like this is suddenly an episode of Boy Meets World?
I found his socks in my quarters.
Dirty socks?
Not worse, clean. In a drawer. Wait, is that where we are now? Who we are?
And just to round out the sitcom cliches, the show even tosses in a jealous woman trope between Chapel and La'an over Spock, with La'an actually saying,
"No, please, don't be one of those women."
It's lazy, it's sexist, and it's about as far from Trek's ethos of showing a future that's better than today as you can get. We learned years ago that writing the jealous woman trope was outdated for today. Why are we showing it in the future? And aside here, I'll probably do a whole video on this because there's actually some genuinely important history here, but this constant shoving of Spock into romances with T'Pring, Chapel, and now La'an fundamentally misunderstands why Spock became a sex symbol all the way back in the 1960s. Like legit, Spock was a teenage sex idol, and it wasn't because he had a revolving door of girlfriends, that was Kirk.
All this power surging and throbbing, yet under control. Are you like that, Captain?
Spock was hot because he was broody, closed off, and visibly wrestling with emotions that he couldn't fully control. It was that tension, plus Nimoy's gloriously hairy chest, that made the romances he did have electric, and made plenty of guys, gals, and MB pals swoon, imagining that they could be the one to break through his walls, if you know what I mean.
I can't lose you now, Mr. Spock. I can't.
I have a responsibility to this ship. To that man on the bridge.
Excuse me. And that same tension, along with his layered, intimate bond with Kirk, who actually did break through those walls in text, inspired countless fan fictions, launched slash fiction itself as a genre between Kirk and Spock, and was the main driver of early fanzine culture. Which literally started with a zine called Spockanalia that made mostly stories about how hot Spock was, and which was critical to saving Star Trek as a franchise and building the convention scene that's now the backbone of nerd culture and Hollywood marketing itself. By reducing Spock to just another hot guy to ship around, Spock ends up becoming a bland heteronormative male power fantasy, and it flattens the very emotional complexity that made him iconic in the first place. Worse, it pulls the women around him into his gravity well, warping their arcs that were once explored on their own terms, like La'an wrestling with her augment heritage, into generic relationship drama centered on him. And to be very clear, it's not like the show can't do something interesting with these relationships. In fact, they almost do. Episode 3 actually sets up that Pike approves an illegal mission into Klingon space to save his girlfriend Batel after she has complications from using Illyrian DNA to survive her Gorn abortion in the season premiere. Which is a sentence that I just said. But it turns out that M'Benga, Chapel, and even Spock knew that the treatment would end up hybridizing Batel with the Gorn DNA, but hid that from Pike because Batel asked them to because she knew he'd fight her choice to do so.
You're gonna change her? Tell me! Joseph. What are you gonna do to her? It was her decision, Chris.
All this leads to an actually genuinely compelling scene. Pike says that he wishes he could have been told so that he could have had the chance to support Batel, but Batel points out, correctly it's assumed, that he wouldn't have.
Yeah, because it wasn't about you.
I just wish I'd had the opportunity to be able to say all the right things, to tell you I'd be there no matter what choice you made.
And that would have been nicer, but you know what? We both know you, and we know that you would have demanded we find another way.
This brushes up against a very real modern issue. Men think that they get a vote in what women can do with their bodies, both politically and personally. This could have been a great Trek storyline. People in the future facing the same problems we do now, but because this is supposed to be a society built on growth, actually learning to do better. Now, I didn't need a giant neon sign screaming, "This is about women's bodily autonomy!" All it needed was Pike going on a journey to realize, oh, maybe I'm not entitled to have a say in Patel's body. Modeling what it looks like for a man to interrogate how he's expressing his masculinity and emerge stronger and more of a man for it. That would have been an earnest Star Trekian arc, taking a problem of today and showing us a future without our ingrained cultural norms that could help us imagine a better way through it. Instead, we get that one really strong scene that leaves the tension unresolved in a way that begs for follow-up, and then the show just never does. Instead, what we get several episodes later is Pike blurting out Patel's private medical info to her boss in a comedy bit where he's turned into a Vulcan.
Additionally, her treatments are experimental. While it is understandable that Marie desires to return to work, you can see how it is not logical.
And sure, Pike isn't fully himself in that episode, and oh boy, we'll get to that episode. So it's played as bad within the context of it and over the top, but it also still reinforces the idea that Pike doesn't respect Patel's autonomy, and the show just never comes back to resolve this idea in any way, shape, or form. Instead, Batel gives him a quick scolding, and Pike mopes around like a sitcom boyfriend in the doghouse, literally having lines like,
I have to go talk to Marie before she changes the locks on my quarters.
Can they change locks in the future? What is this? It's basically become Star Trek Everybody Loves Pike, a safe surface-level 90s sitcom take on power, respect, and relationships that reduces everything to, haha, men are just dumb around women, right?
I expect your decision by the end of the week.
Am I slightly forgiven now?
Bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, 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 bum. And in the end, Pike just comes off like a guy who hasn't unpacked his shit, Vulcan brain or not, because the show isn't interested in going deeper than its traditionalist comfort zone. We can see this too in how the show leans on outdated queer coding and tropes. Take again Rhys Darby, who plays the character like a flamboyant gay-coded wedding planner, literally prancing around talking about outfits, before Pike cracks a joke.
This wedding planner of yours is something. Never thought of Andorians as being so detail-oriented.
Which makes zero sense in-universe, since Pike, as my friend Vera Wild pointed out, literally had an Andorian chief engineer who was so detail-oriented he didn't even need to see.
Hemmer may not be able to see, but his other senses compensate.
Compensate? They are superior.
But this is just a surface-level gag straight out of Will and Grace with a sci-fi coat of paint. He's flamboyant into fashion, must be gay. I mean Andorian. Also, this is my own little grief here, but when is Star Trek gonna make it canon that Andorians have 4 genders like they do in the novel series? Give me the 4-gendered Andorians, Kurtzman, you coward! Then there's the Metron. Oh boy, is there the Metron, an alien pulled straight out of the original series for nostalgia's sake. But back in the 1960s, aliens were often coded as gender ambiguous to make them feel other. The Metron was one of them, but so were the Telosians in The Cage, who were played by women but dubbed with men's voices.
The female you call number one has the superior mind and would produce highly intelligent children.
Although she seems to lack emotion, this is largely a pretense. She often has fantasies involving you.
Strange New Worlds repeats this trope, only more overtly, casting a non-binary actor and then digitally shifting their voice back and forth between male and female tones.
Two barbaric species, each determined
to destroy the other.
On paper, that sounds like a progressive update. Look, we cast a queer!
We got one!
But in practice, it's recycling the decades-old coding where non-binary equals alien strange, not us. Trek was already doing that in the 60s, 90s, and 2000s, and critics called it out then. To still be leaning on it in 2025 feels aggressively regressive, especially for a franchise about inclusion and how non-binary people are currently being targeted in the United States as others overtly. And it seems like it's only being done here this way because the writers thought, well, that's how the original series did it.
Does my appearance surprise you, Captain?
You seem more like a boy.
Without actually asking how to evolve the depiction for today, or, if you needed to have the Metron in the episode in the first place. But all of this would be less of a problem if the show had any non-binary or trans characters in it at all. Instead, the show seems to be pulling back from anything approaching queerness. Take how Chapel was alluded to being bisexual in an offhanded line in season 1.
No attachments, it's just for fun. Zero commitments page.
It's more like a book than a page, and you said the same thing about that gal on Arjulius too.
And even dated a trans woman in a Pride Month tie-in comic, where, by the way, she was literally on the cover. But in the show, she only ever focuses on men. And to be very clear, as a bisexual person, being bi doesn't stop just because you're in a straight passing or even a gay passing relationship. But the show seems allergic to letting Chapel express attraction to anyone besides men. Same goes for Una and Ortegas, who both had queer-coded moments in season 1, which was probably more the actors choosing to do that than the writing, and that has never been brought back up.
I saved your life. That's something, right?
As grateful as I am for whatever this is, we really should be hurrying on to engineering.
And what makes this stand out even more is that every other modern Trek show has had overtly queer characters who are part of the regular cast. Sure, they've had their issues in the depiction of these characters. You've had Discovery's endless bury your gay arcs, or Picard, Discovery, and even Lower Decks treating queer couples like they're legally required to break up every season, because heaven help us if we have writers who know how to write LGBTQ people having long-term healthy relationships. But at least those characters exist, and most of those shows actually tried to address the concerns that people had about them when people critiqued it. Not you. Even 60s or 90s Trek, while never allowed to be explicitly queer thanks to studio executive Rick Berman, who, according to writers like Ronald D. Moore, Brian Fuller, and David Gerrold, repeatedly shot down queer characters over the course of numerous shows and movies for fear of controversy, was rarely this skittish about non-normative relationships. Riker and Troy basically read as having an open relationship, and in The Price, when Blandy McBlanderboy struts in trying to stir the pot, Riker overtly eschews the jealous boyfriend trope by basically saying, "Cool, my girl Troy's getting some? Have fun, champ."
If you can bring happiness into Deanna's life, nothing would please me more. You know, you're really not such a bad sword, Rawl. Except you don't have any values, beyond the value of today's bid, that is. Deanna is just the woman to bring some meaning to your sorry existence, if you're smart enough to take it.
On Deep Space Nine, Andrew Robinson has openly talked about how he played Garrick as gay and attracted to Bashir from his very first scene. Jadzia Dax had a sapphic kiss on screen as heavily implied to be bisexual. And Voyager had Tuvok and Neelix.
Come on, just a little itty-bitty smile. Just let the mouth curl a little then.
I just realized, Tuvix is literally their ship name.
Sex. I beg your pardon.
Even Gene Roddenberry himself, in his own unique, horny, sex-addicted, male-gazy way, wanted Trek's future to show more open sexual norms and spoke about, in the months before his death, adding gay characters into Star Trek The Next Generation. Hell, Kirk is even described in Vonda M. McIntyre's novel The Entropy Effect as having been tangentially part of a large polycule. Where's that Kirk? Trek hasn't been this aggressively straight since the Bush-era Star Trek Enterprise, where Rick Berman literally wrote an entire B-plot about Malcolm Reed hooking up with an alien just to no-homo him in order to shut down rumors spread in TV Guide that the character would be gay. And it's hard not to wonder if something similar is happening here. This is the same show that gave us the incredible Captain Angel in Season 1, the non-binary space pirate and partner to my freak king, Cybok. And clearly set up for them to return. And yet, in a crime against Shaka-Ree himself, they've never come back. You can't help but wonder if that's because of who Angel is, a sign that the show is deliberately leaning into traditionalist romances, erasing queerness, at a moment when queer and trans lives are under attack, trying to mirror the culture of the time instead of challenging it. Now, since I've been talking about this for a few minutes now, I want to be very clear that I'm not bringing all this up as a queer trans fan with an axe to grind who only judges Star Trek based on how much diversity it has in it, as I'm sure I will be accused of on r_Trek_. Oh, yes, I see you. You think I'm not subscribed to every single Star Trek subreddit?
You fools! You've underestimated the terrifying scope of my autistic hyperfixation!
Or maybe you haven't, considering you're several minutes deep into a very long video about a hyper-analysis of a single season of a 60-year-old franchise.
I'm not trapped in here with you, you're trapped in here with me.
I wasn't even name-searching myself like I'm J.K. Rowling. But I bring all of this up because Strange New Worlds' handling of romance, gender, and queerness, topics that I am well-versed in, is a great singular example of the show's broader disinterest in using Star Trek as a vehicle to challenge our modern-day norms and imagine a future beyond them. You know, the thing that Star Trek's supposed to do. At a time when queer and transness are so politicized and under attack, Star Trek has the unique power to both allegorize those struggles and model a more inclusive future within a mainstream franchise, something that it's always done at its best. Yet, Strange New Worlds seems uninterested in doing either of those things. The show's incuriosity doesn't just cause it to reinforce ingrained ideals of heteronormativity, it also slips into other unaddressed assumptions within our culture, like biological essentialism, the idea that who you are is dictated in large part by your genetics. This has been a problem for a while on Strange New Worlds, most overtly with its treatment of Spock, a biracial child of a human and a Vulcan. I broke down in my video on Season 2 how this came up in the episode Charades, where Spock gets turned fully human and the story frames his Vulcan biology as the only thing that gave him emotional control.
Whoever did this seems to have made you human.
What the
But this season escalates these issues in the pseudo-sequel to Charades, 4.5 Vulcans. God, even saying the title feels wrong. Here, Pike, La'an, Chapel, and Uhura are transformed into Vulcans using Chapel's Kirkovian virus, and suddenly they start acting quote-unquote logical.
This feeling is unusual.
My perception has increased.
Everything I once found dull now seems to be
Fascinating.
The biggest and most obvious problem with this right off the bat is that it implies Vulcans are biologically emotionless and logical. But Trek, right from the original series, has always made it fairly clear that Vulcans actually feel more intense emotions than humans do, which resulted in them building an entire culture of ritual and philosophy around suppressing those emotions by following the teachings of their ancient spiritual leader Surak, who preached logic as a discipline, not as a genetic trait.
Live long and prosper. Image of Surak. Father of all we now hold true.
The image of Surak read in your face what is in your mind, Spock.
As I turned and my eyes beheld you, I displayed emotion. I beg forgiveness.
The cause was more than sufficient. Speak no further of it.
Indeed, Vulcans actually have one of the richest, most complex cultures within the canon of Star Trek, having been repeatedly fleshed out across numerous series, movies, time periods, and well-respected tie-in media like Diane Duane's Spock's World novel. And reducing that to logic DNA is just lazy biological essentialism. But I guess we have to do our tragic mulatto storyline in the year of our Q 2025. Now, before y'all start yelling at me, to be fair, the writers do quick toss in a hand wave through Una's log entry at the top of the episode, where she says that the Kirkovian virus gave them Spock's cultural learnings somehow.
Because they derived the serum from Spock's perceived experiences, it has left our crew in a kind of logical state that normally takes Vulcans years to develop socially.
Few things with that, though. First off, we know that the virus was created using Spock's DNA, so it still implies that the cultural learnings are in Spock's DNA somehow. But being honest, I'd be more willing to bet that that voiceover line was only added after the show got online backlash to a clip of this episode that they showed at San Diego Comic-Con last year. And I say that because most of the rest of the episode constantly contradicts this. Take Patton Oswalt Vulcan flatly declaring,
I am intrigued. Seriously, I am very intrigued. As a full Vulcan, I really cannot lie.
Which seems to imply that because he's biologically a full Vulcan, he's physically incapable of lying. Which, okay, points for the original series throwback, because yes, early Trek did have lines about Vulcans being physically incapable of lying.
Jim, forgetting how well we both know Spock, the simple fact that he's a Vulcan means he's incapable of telling a lie.
Except that Vulcans lie all the damn time. Spock lies in the Enterprise incident literally about Vulcans being unable to lie in order to cover his own ass while pretending to defect to the Romulans.
There's a well-known saying, or is it a myth, that Vulcans are incapable of lying.
It is no myth.
Which is also an episode, by the way, where the Romulan commander has the hots for Spock because he is so emotionally closed off.
I was not aware of that aspect of Romulan society.
As a Vulcan, you would study it. As a human, you would find ways to appreciate it.
The full Vulcan Valeris straight up lies her way through an entire conspiracy theory in the Undiscovered Country movie. And then you've got Tuvok, who we literally meet in Star Trek Voyager's pilot episode where he's working undercover as a double agent for Starfleet. Like that was the whole reason that Chakotay was angry at Tuvok until the writers forgot about it after 2 seasons.
In case you hadn't noticed, Captain Janeway is not in any condition to make decisions. I'm in command. Is that understood?
Yes, sir.
Good.
The man was basically living a lie for months, and he even says outright in that show that Vulcans can lie, it's just frowned upon.
Am I correct in assuming that Vulcans are incapable of lying?
We are capable of telling lies. However, I have never found it prudent or necessary to do so.
It's a cultural taboo, not a biological impossibility. So when this episode tries to backfill with cultural learnings, but then doubles down on Vulcans being biologically hardwired, it's like, pick a lane. Are Vulcans a culture with social taboos? Or are they just born with a no-lying gene? Because Trek has been generally pretty clear for 50-odd years now that it's the first one. But okay, some of you out there are like, well, the writers don't necessarily need to pay attention to canon, they should just be able to write their own episode, which I generally agree with. But the best sci-fi, I think, makes a distinction between biology shaping culture and biology being culture. One of my favorite examples of this, by the way, is Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time book, which builds an entire society of sentient spiders. Don't read this book if you have arachnophobia, by the way, but it's really great, where elements of their culture, like seeing the world through webs of connection, grows naturally out of their biology. But then the book shows how that culture shifts and changes over time. At its best, Trek gets this too. Vulcans didn't just pop out. Ow, I can't get my leg up that high. I was gonna try and do a pop out of the womb thing and implying my vagina, but that just didn't work. Anyways, Vulcans don't just pop out of the womb reciting math equations in perfect monotone. Their whole culture of discipline and ritual came about because their emotions are more volatile than humans, so they created a social structure to manage it.
She has lost all control.
Having biology inform culture is good writing. Biology as culture is just lazy shorthand. And this episode does that constantly. Take how Pike and company, after completing their mission but finding out they're stuck as Vulcans, stay in Vulcan outfits the entire episode instead of returning to their Starfleet uniform. So we get Starfleet officers strutting around in Vulcan robes with Lurpas like it's their birthright. It's very much giving white guy who went to Kyoto one time and won't take off his kimono because he feels so connected to their culture energy. Seriously, doesn't Starfleet have a uniform code? Or are we back on the Troy gets to wear her sexy onesie rules until Captain Jellicoe storms in to yell at everyone to put on their damn uniforms?
I prefer a certain formality on the bridge. I'd appreciate it if you wore a standard uniform when you're on duty.
Of course, sir.
Pike even wears the robes in front of a Vulcan who grew up on Vulcan, and it's never mentioned because apparently if you're genetically Vulcan now, cultural appropriation doesn't count. Because again, the show is equating culture with biology. I mean, imagine if I, as someone who has Welsh heritage and extended family in Wales, but no real personal tie to Welsh culture, decided that gave me the right to strut around in a giant red dragon costume while belting out hymns in a language I don't understand and demanding that all of you address me as Jessie of the Valleys. Just because my DNA test brings up Welsh doesn't mean I suddenly earned the right to cosplay stereotypes of a culture I was never raised in. Now, to be fair to Strange New Worlds, this is not a problem that it invented out of thin air. Star Trek has been playing footsie with biological essentialism since it began, really. The franchise loves to reduce entire alien species to one personality trait. Klingons are aggressive, Ferengi are greedy, Vulcans are logic bots. You get the idea. A prime example of this comes in Voyager Season 2 episode Faces, where the biracial B'Elanna Torres is literally split into two by alien science, her Klingon half and her human half. The episode tries to explore her biracial identity in an interesting way. I mean, as my friend the fat culture critic Sarah pointed out, many biracial people will imagine what it would be like to split themselves in two. But the episode ends up reinforcing the idea that she's nothing more than her DNA. Her Klingon side carries all of her aggression, and her human side carries all of her vulnerability.
I was looking for a way to escape. Looking! I'll show you the way to escape. This and this. That's the way you respond to every situation, isn't it? If it doesn't work, hit it. If it's in your way, knock it down.
Since Trek often frames B'Elanna's heritage, much like Spock's, as a metaphor for real biracial people, it ends up replicating the logic that some races are just like that, which is a racist line of thought. Yet unlike Faces or even Season 2 Charades, 4.5 Vulcans manages to be so much worse because it leans openly into the implications of racism and also eugenics. Because once Pike and crew get their Vulcan makeovers, they keep referring to Spock as half Vulcan in contrast to them being full Vulcans, as a kind of recurring joke.
5 Vulcans should be more than enough down there.
4 1/2.
Spock is only half Vulcan, whereas the 4 of us
are fully Vulcan.
Is that not logical, Spock?
Indeed, it is.
The unspoken thesis of this is his biracial identity makes him less Vulcan. To be very clear, this is not logical, this is racist. Because contrary to pop culture conception, logic isn't just blurting out factoids like you're a Wikipedia page in cosplay. Logic is a method of reasoning.
Logic is the beginning of wisdom, Valeris, not the end.
Two people can both logically reach opposite conclusions depending on their premises. Someone can go, logically, I shouldn't buy the Lord of the Rings Lego set in order to save money. Or you can have someone else say, logically, if I don't buy the Lord of the Rings Lego set, then I'll have more money to buy the One Piece one later. Both are logical, but one ends in financial prudence, the other ends with me proudly building the Going Merry. Ah, who am I kidding? I bought both anyways. Actually, this is my fiance's, this isn't mine. So, I'm only at episode like 150, everyone. I just finished Alabasta. I don't know what else is going on in that show. Do not spoil it for me in the comments, or else Erin will kill me. She's literally standing right off screen. Hi, dear. Do you want to say anything?
No, it's okay, but you covered everything.
So when the episode insists on calling Spock half a Vulcan without ever pushing back on it, it's smuggling in the assumption that being a full Vulcan is purely about genetics. A move that doesn't just fall into lazy biological essentialism, but straight up race science. And the fact that the crew frames it as logical only makes it worse, because that mirrors exactly how imperialist and colonial thinkers historically justified racism and eugenics, by branding their prejudices as scientific reason, rather than what it is, racist pseudoscience. But Spock, unlike his cosplay-committed crewmates, actually grew up on Vulcan. He lived in the culture. He has the Vulcan heritage. He's the only one in that room who is actually Vulcan in any meaningful way. Now, the Season 2 Strange New Worlds episode Charades played a similar card, but at the very least, that story centered upon his mother Amanda, and on her sacrifices navigating Vulcan society and the prejudices she endured as the human mother of a biracial child.
You were shunned by Vulcan mothers.
But you were happy. And her judgment was a sign of their own weakness, not ours.
And yet, I see now what you gave up. What you chose to live through as a human on Vulcan.
There was actually a really decent point in there, however clumsily it was done through biological essentialism. So, when I saw the clip from Comic-Con of 4.5 Vulcans, I thought, okay, they're doing this racist biological essentialism again, but at the very least, more than likely based on this clip, the story will at least have a message of how Spock isn't less Vulcan, he's actually more because he lived it. Nope. It's just the same racist gag repeated on loop with zero interrogation throughout the episode. Most of the episode just uses the Vulcan setup as a backdrop for more stereotypical relationship drama. Yay! Which, fine. But even these plots end up reinforcing problematic norms. Case in point, Uhura literally mind-meld brainwashes Beto into being her perfect boyfriend.
I recognize your desire for a sibling quarrel, but I will not be engaging at this time.
The moral the episode thinks it's delivering is nice enough. Love people for who they are, not who you want them to be.
You know, you may think that this Vulcan Uhura is smarter or whatever, but if she can't see what makes my brother great, then she's an idiot.
But the way that it executes this is yikes. The episode makes a point of saying that Beto consented to the mind meld, but also shows that Uhura took it further than he expected. And instead of treating that as a boundary violation, the narrative waves it off as fine because he technically said yes to the initial thing.
I am very, very sorry.
Yeah, you said that, but you still brainwashed me.
Technically, you agreed to the brainwashing.
So, cool. I guess we're just not gonna linger on the fact that the show wrote a character played by a non-binary actor of color into a storyline where they're framed as openly ignoring the need for ongoing enthusiastic consent and who comes across like a groomer. Instead, the only resolution we get to all the half-Vulcan racist jokes is Patton Oswalt Vulcan telling Spock how cool humans are.
What I would give to be half the human you are. All of my life, I have studied humans, your music, your culture, your savoir-faire. It is as the ancient humans once called it, very cool.
Which, sure, is a fine sentiment. I rather think humans are cool too. But the issue wasn't Spock needing to appreciate his human side, it was that his friends racistly kept calling him less of a Vulcan. And the show just never deals with that, which is wild because this very series already told a smarter, and queerer, by the way, version of the story all the way back in Season 1. Remember when my non-binary king... Wait, can I say king if someone's non-binary? My non-binary monarch, Captain Angel, told Spock that cultural expectations don't have to define you?
You know, all species put things into boxes. It's like you're either this or you're that. And sometimes we act a certain way to fit people's expectations, but that's not necessarily who we are. And sometimes, like on the bridge just now, they can limit us.
You are proposing I better balance my human and Vulcan natures.
I'm saying maybe you're neither.
That whether the cultural pressure is for you to try to fit in to be more logical like Vulcan society asks you to be, or more emotional like human society asks you to be, or by implication forced into binary gender roles as Captain Angel is implied to be based on them being non-binary, you can still choose who you want to be.
That is nonsensical. If I'm not human or Vulcan, what am I?
I mean, that's not my question to answer.
That was a sharp, anti-biological essentialism narrative woven directly into a queer-coded story, making this not only talk about modern issues of how queer people are pigeonholed and forced to act a certain way in order to fit in, it actually managed to push Spock's arcs forward in a fresh, modern way, which is no small feat for a character who's been around for 60 years. But here, in this episode, nah, it's just be cool with being half Vulcan because humans invented cheese and Netflix, apparently.
Some humans eat a great deal of meat, and also cheese.
How much cheese?
A great deal of cheese.
But don't worry, it gets worse, because Patton Oswalt Vulcan agrees to help Spock help his friends, and we get this bizarre after-credit scene where Spock performs and teaches humanness to Doug.
High five. Down low. Victory.
Now, to be very clear, this is obviously meant as a little light-hearted comedy beat, but to me, it actually reads rather creepy, because it comes across as Doug fetishizing Spock's racialized human traits. Here, his human qualities aren't celebrated as part of his identity, they're a spectacle for Doug's entertainment and learning, commodified in ways that ironically dehumanize Spock. Fetishizing racialized cultural or bodily traits has deep roots in colonial violence. European colonizers, for example, routinely exoticized black bodies and cultures, most infamously with Sarah Bartman, whose physique was paraded as a spectacle for white audiences throughout the 19th century, alongside exhibitions of African culture that were framed as a primitive curiosity for Westerners to gawk at. The same logic echoes today when wealthy, often white-passing women like Kim Kardashian profit off the commodification of black aesthetic, while black women themselves are still punished and marginalized for them. And within context of Star Trek, there are some unfortunate echoes of that colonial history within this scene with Doug. The prequel series Star Trek Enterprise showed Vulcans spending decades after Zefram Cochrane's warp flight guiding humanity, holding back, interfering with, and controlling the development of human science and our entry into planetary politics, especially around the Warp 5 program. We know you just invented warp drive, but have you considered not having fun with it for hundreds of years while we supervise?
We may need to defer to their judgment.
We've been deferring to their judgment for 100 years.
John.
How much longer?
Until you've proven you're ready.
Ready to what?
To look beyond your provincial attitudes and your volatile nature.
Volatile? You have no idea how much I'm restraining myself from knocking you on your ass.
Ah, our himbo Captain Archer. But Vulcans there cast themselves as the more advanced civilization, paternalistically shaping humanity's future in the same way colonizers often justified controlling other nations for their own good because they were primitives that needed to be uplifted by Western industrialization. Now, to be very clear, I don't think the writers of Strange New Worlds were thinking about this canon history at all while writing this episode, and that's fine. Nobody needs to memorize 60 years of franchise canon just to write an episode of a show. It's better to focus on making your own story work first and foremost, and try to bring in canon as you can. However, this episode goes out of its way to point a big neon arrow sign at that same history of Vulcans anyways. The only reason Pike and crew need to become Vulcans in the first place is that they need to infiltrate a planet the Vulcans have been actively shaping for decades. We learn that they gave them nuclear power, which nearly wiped them out in the first place, hence the mission that our characters are going on, while also at the same time concealing the very existence of the Federation, hence why our characters needed to turn into Vulcans in the first place as well. That's classic soft imperial paternalism baked right into the text of this episode.
The Vulcans made contact with the Tazarians before the founding of the Federation.
Crime loophole.
But the Vulcans were the engineers of pre-warp prohibitions. Why would they do that?
Several hundred years ago, the Vulcans rescued Tazar from annihilation due to planetary collapse. They provided them with technology to sustain themselves, including a nuclear-based method of powering their entire world.
And so against that backdrop, as well as the history between human and Vulcans in Starfleet canon, Doug's wide-eyed fascination with human quirks doesn't come across as a harmless gag. It reads more like a citizen of a former empire exoticizing the very culture his civilization once held influence over. But we as the audience are meant to laugh at this scene, where Spock stereotypes all humans as eating too much cheese, because Vulcans don't actually exist. So what harm could a scene like this do, right? And yes, it's not a particularly harmful scene in terms of replicating existing colonial norms, but the logic it's based on only works because the writers aren't self-aware of the histories that they're echoing, histories they likely haven't had to think about because they've never lived under their modern implications. Imagine a black man, coerced into performing his culture in order to save his friends, joking to a white guy, "Oh, black people eat a lot of watermelon and talk in hip-hop slang." Suddenly, the problem becomes obvious, doesn't it? Again, it's not to say that these histories are equivalent. What I am saying is that the logic is underlying the same. Even the specific human traits chosen in this scene, which were almost certainly improvised by Patton Oswalt and Ethan Peck, whom I don't blame at all as they were likely just told to riff based on an already fucked up premise, flattens all of humanity into a white Western able-bodied template.
They are horror movies.
Are the movies horrible?
Yes. No.
Not everyone can eat cheese, not everyone watches horror movies, and the specific contraction jokes they talk about only work in English.
Is that not what I am doing?
Isn't that what I am doing?
Isn't.
Yet the scene universalizes all of those things as if they define the human experience. It's a recurring Trek problem. The idea of human defaults to Anglophone, Western, and white, and the franchise rarely notices how alienating that is. Even further, this whole purity of genetics theme runs throughout the entire episode in weird ways. Take how when Pike serves Vulcan food to Batel's boss and starts rambling about the diabolical nature of salt, the Vulcan boss replies,
"If it is not found naturally within the food, it serves no purpose."
It comes across like Vulcans are genetically hardwired, even down to their taste buds, to be obsessed with purity. Which is not how other Trek series have portrayed Vulcans' food preferences, where they're mainly portrayed as just culturally disapproving of foods that don't fit within a logical dietary regimen, not genetically wired to believe in food purity.
No, thank you.
It's delicious.
It's mostly sugar.
But Vulcans don't have a sweet tooth. May not be good for the body, but it sure is good for the soul.
This is reinforced by the fact that the crew only starts racializing Spock once they turn genetically Vulcan. Unless the point the episode is trying to make is that all the characters were already secretly racist towards Spock and the transformation just loosened their tongues. Which, yeah, would also be very bad.
I am Vulcan.
Flatter, more robotic. I am Vulcan. I love logic.
Do I really sound like that?
Yes.
And sure, Vulcans have looked down on humans plenty before. That was basically Star Trek Enterprise's whole shtick with Vulcans.
We'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
I have none. Humans have never held much interest for me.
Not to mention how many of them have treated Spock.
It is truly remarkable, Spock, that you have achieved so much, despite your disadvantage.
If you would clarify, Minister. To what disadvantage are you referring?
Your human mother.
But that's always been framed as cultural prejudice. Vulcans dismissing anything that they see as emotional or illogical, like humans.
Spock is half Vulcan. Another of your experiments.
And that framing matters especially around the character of Spock because it mirrors the stigma that biracial people and other minorities face even when they're considered part of the community.
You're a tyran, Spock. You could never be a true Vulcan.
That is not true. Your father brought shame to Vulcan. He married a human.
Think of Michael Berman, for example. She was raised on Vulcan and excelled academically, and even learned the culture of being more emotionless, and yet was still treated as lesser because she was human.
Their decision is wrong. She graduated at the top of her class. Her test scores are better than any Vulcan.
There are other metrics. Spiritual discipline, martial arts, logic.
I want to go home.
Humiliation is a human emotion.
I'm sorry, Sarek.
So yes, Vulcans were racist, but it wasn't part of their DNA. I mean, if Vulcans' belief in racial superiority was literally in their DNA, then why would they ever join a multicultural federation in the first place? The only full Vulcan here who doesn't come off like an inherent jerk is Doug, and the episode goes out of its way to imply that that's because he's the most human-like Vulcan.
My parents were drawn to human names. Perhaps you've come across my sister, Susan. She is an aide to the First Minister of Vulcan, or my cousin, Pete, who is a veterinarian.
He's one of the good ones because he's more white. Sorry, I mean more human. So after all of this, what we end up with is an episode that runs on the same logic as a vaudeville minstrel show, where actors put on the identity of a marginalized group through things like blackface and exaggerated their racialized stereotypes for laughs. Now, again, obviously blackface and the crew's Vulcan cosplay are not equivalent in historical or real-world harm, but I'm just pointing out how the narrative logic here is the same. The show creates a story where we watch the crew perform racialized Vulcan stereotypes for comedy. And because Vulcans aren't real, it's easy to hand-wave it off as harmless. Don't worry, it's just a goofy comedy episode with made-up aliens. But the structure of the joke relies on the same logic that underpins some of the ugliest performance traditions in American history.
Honestly, this feels wrong. I mean, just please don't take any pictures of me.
To be very clear, I love Star Trek comedy episodes. They're some of my favorites. But comedy always begs the question, what are we laughing at, and why? Strange New Worlds wants to be the funny Star Trek show like Lower Decks before it, right down, by the way, to copying their cetacean ops gag.
I would love to, but there's no time.
But without realizing that Lower Decks actually thinks about what its jokes mean. People will often dismiss Lower Decks as just nostalgia, as if its jokes are just the reference to Star Trek past in and of themselves. Steve. But if you actually look deeply at Lower Decks, I actually think that it often smartly uses its humor to dig into Trek's themes. In the episode Here All Trust Nothing, my favorite gal Tendi clashes with another Orion Starfleet officer who does act like the pirate stereotype of all Orions, and who assumes that she is just the same.
So real talk, what's the first ship you ever stole, Ma?
Actually, I don't do that stuff.
Oh yeah, no, me neither.
Look, not every Orion does the pirate criminal thing, okay?
Whoa, easy. I'm starting to feel some of those aggressive female pheromones firing off.
We don't all have those!
Until it's revealed that he actually grew up in Ohio and only performs a stereotype of being an Orion pirate that he learned from pulp trash softcore mags because that's what other humans that he grew up around expected of him.
I got adopted by humans, and everything I know about Orions I learned from the Hollow novels. I have bad ones too, the ones with the boobs on the cover.
Why would you lie?
Well, people just expect Orions to act like that, so it's always worked for me. I never knew any other Orions back in Ohio, so no one ever checked me on it.
So here we can see how Lower Decks, in a very similar way to what Strange New Worlds wants to do, uses comedy around identity and cultural expectations, but does so in a way that eschews biological essentialism and ends up being a story in true Star Trek spirit about choosing your own identity within a multicultural future.
Yeah, I get that. It's hard when you feel like people expect you to act a certain way, but you just gotta be yourself. Doesn't matter what other people expect.
I'm sorry that I put all that on you too.
It's hilarious, but it's also a sharp commentary on how people who are still racialized, yet cut off from the culture that they are racialized within, often feel pressured to perform a shallow, caricatured version of that culture in order to fit in. FD Signifier, for example, has done great videos talking about this within the context of black kids who grow up in predominantly white communities. 4.5 Vulcans, by contrast, unthinkingly leans on racist and eugenics logics in service of cheap gags and laughs. And we can see this in the episode's worst storyline, La'an's. After becoming a Vulcan, La'an suddenly turns weirdly aggressive and expansionist, literally trying to start a war so the Federation can conquer other species.
We're going to reach out to the Klingons and convince them the Orions are plotting to invade. Then we tell the Orions Tholians are behind the plot. But we tell the Tholians that the real puppet masters are the Gorn hegemony.
Kirk and others even start to comment that she's strange even for a Vulcan.
I've worked with Vulcans
served under them, they're not super big on mutiny. Doesn't she seem a little extra manipulative? Oh, fuck or something.
With the implication being that she's acting more like a Romulan.
Perhaps if we speak of it simultaneously.
Romulans.
Which frames Romulans as genetically more aggressive instead of just a cultural offshoot of Vulcans. In fact, in Star Trek Enterprise, we learn that the Romulans left Vulcan specifically because they didn't want to listen to the teachings of Surak and wanted to go their own way. They weren't genetically more aggressive, they just chose a different cultural path than the Vulcans.
Our forebears had the same roots and origins, something you wouldn't understand, Captain. We can appreciate the Vulcans, our distant brothers.
This also, by the way, completely misses the point of Spock's arc as we see it in The Next Generation and later Star Trek Discovery, where Spock's life's work culminated in the unification of Vulcan and Romulan cultures. His entire franchise-long journey was about embracing his unique identity as a man of two worlds, breaking down those cultural expectations and binaries within himself, and then using his non-binary status to literally change society for the better by helping it embrace difference and diversity.
Spock believed that together you could create something bigger than yourselves. That's what this quorum is. That's what Navarre is. That's what the Federation is.
Resulting in one of the most Star Trekian and coherent arcs that it runs across numerous series of this decades-long franchise. But sure, let's just make the Romulans the bad blood cousins. But even worse, the episode ends with Spock telling La'an that the Vulcan serum made her the more aggressive Romulan because of her augment DNA from her ancestor Khan Noonien Singh, who was himself genetically augmented in the eugenics wars, which suddenly made her supposedly predisposed to aggression, hierarchy, and competition.
Being Vulcan affected you differently. You are aggressive, paranoid, suspicious, arrogant. I believe it is part of your core. You are part human, but also part augment, a relative of Khan Noonien Singh.
And you have a wretched human half. What is your point?
So apparently the episode is just saying that fascism just isn't her DNA, I guess. This is just straight up eugenics logic. Some people are just born bad because of their DNA. And it completely undercuts the show's own messaging. Just last season, we had a gorgeous scene where a lawyer who was fighting Starfleet's institutionalized anti-augment bigotry tells La'an, herself an augment, that she isn't a monster, that she only views herself as lesser because the Federation society that she grew up within taught her to hate herself, and that, verbatim,
genetics is not destiny, despite what you may have been taught. If you have of yourself, it's not your own. It was drilled into you. You were not born a monster. You were just born with the capacity for actions, good or ill, just like the rest of us.
That scene was so moving and so powerful that it's literally one of my favorite in all of modern Star Trek, let alone Star Trek in general, and it literally made me cry the first time that I heard it. But now apparently genetics does equal destiny because La'an is genetically predisposed to be cartoonishly evil.
Someone we might have to destroy if it came to it.
Destroy, you say?
Along those lines?
But all that's okay, the episode says, because there's a surreal dance sequence between La'an and Spock that is beautifully shot and performed that says they can overcome their biology. Which is completely fucked up in context. The episode, through characters like Chapel, outright implies that their genetics makes them broken pieces, which is why they're perfect romantic partners for each other.
And you and Lon are a far more logical match.
What does that mean?
Occasionally, two broken pieces fit together in the right way.
This storyline could have worked if it was about La'an choosing to stay a Vulcan because she wanted to stay emotionless, to run away from her feelings of self-hate over her augment DNA, or her wanting to escape having to feel the emotions of her PTSD from the Gorn, only to learn that being an augment doesn't make her impure, or having to struggle with trauma doesn't make her lesser, and that she deserves love just like anyone else. But nope. Instead, the takeaway seems to be that La'an just has to get over her commitment issues and accept Spock because their shared genetic impurity makes them excellent partners for each other. It's the idea that racial purity is a thing that exists and that genetics should dictate who you end up with because you can breed a better future together. So no, you don't deserve Lower Decks dolphins, Strange New Worlds. Get them out of your eugenics episode. I do not think the writers intended to echo racist logic with this episode. More than likely, they just wanted to make a goofy Vulcan comedy episode. But that's the problem right there. They had no intention beyond the concept, and as a result, they just defaulted to the same logic already ingrained in our culture to tell the story because it was the easiest thing to do. The idea that identity is dictated by biology. These outgrowths of cultural defaults we've all been taught to treat as natural. Stick with me here because it's the same issue that cropped up with Sydney Sweeney's American Eagle jeans ad a few months ago. The online discourse focused on whether American Eagle's intentions with the ad were innocent or if they were deliberately dog whistling to our increasingly fascist and biological essentialist culture. But to me, the bigger problem wasn't the answer to that question, it was that we could even have a debate about the phrase good genes being neutral at all.
Genes are passed down from parents to offspring, often determining traits like hair color, personality, and even eye color. My genes are blue.
Sydney Sweeney has great genes.
The fact that that phrase can be tossed around to sell genes shows how deeply eugenics logic is baked into our everyday culture. It goes to show that fascism doesn't invent new rhetoric. It just reasserts, violently, the racist, heteronormative, and gendered hierarchies we've already been taught to accept as natural through centuries of colonial thought. It's the same framework that leads to claims like, black people are just inherently violent or less intelligent, or trans women aren't real women because of the biology and are inherently more aggressive and dangerous because they're really just biologically men, or some groups are just born that way. All sold as common sense because people aren't thinking deeper about any of it. And big corporations will always default to pervading cultural norms because they're the safest bet for selling products to the widest possible audience. Which, by the way, ultimately seems to be the main driver behind Star Trek as a franchise nowadays as well. To sell to the widest possible audience by hollowing out its stories until they don't risk offending anyone, or at the very least, the greatest segment of an audience that they think won't be offended by whatever messages that they're putting out. Actor Robert Kaczynski, star of the recent disastrous Star Trek Section 31 movie, even said in an interview that franchise head Alex Kurtzman greenlit that project because Trek's audience was aging up and shrinking and he wanted to get a new audience in.
I spoke to Alex and I spoke to Tunde and they explained to me that Star Trek is dying. Star Trek's fan base has never been enormous. It's always been a small and incredibly passionate group. It's never compared to the Harry Potter fan groups or the Star Wars fan groups. It's never had hundreds of millions of fans around the world. It's always been a dedicated group, and that dedicated group is aging. And we are going to lose Star Trek if we don't bring in new fans, new eyes, and new ways of getting people to love the things that we love. Whereas you have to make different flavors of Star Trek for a different time. You have to try and bring in new people, as you know, that's what Starfleet Academy is going to be about. That's what Section 31's about. This film, and I'm sorry to say it wasn't made for people that love Star Trek. It was made to make people want to learn more about Star Trek.
Which is fine. Trek should try to reach new audiences. I think it should be trying to get a wider and younger audience involved in it. But you don't do that by standing off all the politics and things that made Star Trek unique until the show says nothing at all. That isn't just toothless, it's boring. It erases the very politics and message and identity of what made it matter in the first place, and perhaps more importantly, made it just an interesting thing to watch. Section 31 proves this. It's basically a blander remake of the already bland 2016 Suicide Squad, a movie so gutted by studio meddling it played like 2 hours of trailers slapped together, all spectacle, no substance. And it's extra baffling because James Gunn's far superior The Suicide Squad was both a hit and a sharp takedown of America's CIA-style coups, the exact kind of story Star Trek used to tell with Section 31 loud and clear in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Hey, CIA shit is bad, actually.
Someone has to protect men like you from a universe that doesn't share your sense of right and wrong.
Should I feel sorry for you? Should I be weeping over the burden you are forced to carry in order to protect the rest of us?
If you're gonna steal, Why not steal from the version that worked, that was literally thematically about the same thing that you're talking about? Instead, even that edge gets sanded down into glossing nothing that says the exact opposite message of what Section 31 as a storytelling device was supposed to be about in the first place. The movie's big takeaway is, what if government assassinations and CIA coups were done by your favorite quirky weirdos? And hey, Michelle Yeoh is cool.
You're a bad bitch.
With a stare of death.
Oh, we get it. You're a terrifying, soulless murderer who we can never truly trust.
Love that for us.
Somebody's got to keep things lively.
And similarly, Strange New Worlds leans on shallow nostalgia, stripping away meaning and context just to sell a product. It treats Star Trek not as a living cultural text with 60 years of history and pointed political messages, but as a hollow set of symbols detached from what they once signified, recycled back to us as pure vibes. Case in point, they use La'an, a character who is a descendant of Khan Noonien Singh, a character created in the 60s to be used in an episode to critique the logic of eugenics that was pervasive in American culture since the 1880s, and which creator Gene Roddenberry had actively fought against as a World War II veteran, to tell a story that basically endorses eugenicist logic. Strange New Worlds just wants to use the nostalgic memory of Star Trek without actually coupling it with any messages. We see that most clearly in episode 4 of this season, A Space Adventure Hour. For most of that episode, it's just the writers wanting to do a TNG-style holodeck malfunction episode, which results in a perfectly serviceable law and murder mystery story. It plays like the softer version of Elementary, my dear Data. Instead of the holodeck generating a sentient Moriarty to challenge Data, here it spits out a murder holospock to trick La'an. Because apparently nothing says fun like being gaslit by your coworker's evil hologram. But the holo mystery itself centers on the murder of a TV studio executive who is about to cancel a 1960s sci-fi series that just happens to look an awful lot like Star Trek the original series, called The Last Frontier. Which, yes, is mainly just an excuse for the show to have Paul Wesley and company ham it up parodying the original series in the exact same way that Saturday Night Live has done since roughly the Plasticine era.
Get me the Agonians.
The Agonians are extremely dangerous space creatures.
You don't think I know that?
It leans on overused gags like William Shatner impressions, as well as stale referential franchise in-joke humor like Paul Wesley doing the Riker maneuver sit, which is a referential joke that Jack Quaid already improvised a funnier version of literally last season on this same show.
Riker.
I suppose if you've ever wanted to watch Star Trek cosplay its own parody, this is your moment. But then the episode has Celia Rose Gooding's character, who is an executive on the show, give this big, heartfelt speech about how she loves The Last Frontier because it will hopefully inspire some kids to reach for the stars.
You don't think some kid out there is going to see this show and spend the rest of their life searching the stars? You don't think a person can love a piece of art or music or a story so much that it heals them, shows them parts of themselves they've never even seen before, and give them hope?
It's clearly a speech about Star Trek itself, right? How Star Trek, the original series, was a franchise that inspired people across all these many decades. And it's a lovely sentiment, if a bit self-indulgent. Minor problem, though, there's nothing even remotely inspiring about The Last Frontier, the show that Celia Rose Gooding's character is talking about. It's portrayed as exactly the kind of schlocky pulp that defined most TV science fiction at the time. Monster of the Week camp soaked in American jingoism.
No single company could possibly do it. But combined American industry, sparked by Jim Barnes, could put a rocket on the moon within a year. Well, what do you say, Jim? Do we go to lunch, or do we go to the moon?
Which is precisely why Star Trek the original series stood out. It wasn't ray guns and papier-mâché aliens, it used that aesthetic that most people already knew to cover themes of race, war, and imperialism in a way that actually poked at the norms of 1960s era America rather than reinforce them like most of sci-fi of that type was doing. It said, we can be better. That's what inspired people.
I feel I understand what Earth must have gone through to achieve final peace.
Have
Hell, Star Trek was so abnormal in this regard that the writers doing the tie-in Star Trek Gold Key comics at the time, who had only ever seen pictures of the show and never actually watched it, wrote many of the comics where Kirk and company were the murderous American Jingo militants as all of the rest of sci-fi was at the time. I mean, they literally genocided an entire plant species in those comics, and they also meet Trump. It gets wild. So when Strange New Worlds pats itself on the back with a speech about Star Trek inspiring children delivered over a parody version of Star Trek, it completely shows its hand. Using nostalgia, it essentially argues that the franchise was inspiring simply because of its aesthetics, as if that's what inspired the numerous scientists and astronauts to go to the stars, not Star Trek's messages in and of itself that we could get a better future through science and technology and reaching for space and travel and trying to learn about other people. Which is convenient if you're making a show that takes that aesthetic and makes it look great, but also has all of the depth of a kiddie pool and wants to make people think that's all that the rest of Star Trek ever was. And here is where I have to pause and admit something. I've been avoiding the word postmodernism. Partially because I don't want to sound like Jordan Peterson shouting about postmodern neo-Marxists.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
But postmodernism, broadly speaking, is the critique of grand narratives, sweeping claims that history or culture has one true story or destiny. And that's not an inherently bad thing. I myself have even argued in my videos on Star Wars that things like Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces journey flattens wildly different cultural traditions into one universal Western-coded myth, erasing their specificity so it can sell the idea that we should all assimilate into a dominant colonial culture.
That's, by the way, a universal theme.
What is?
The hero, the fire theft theme usually with a relay race after it.
Conservatives like Peterson themselves attack
postmodernism.
Not because they want to defend diversity of meaning, but because they see it as undermining the Western ideals of masculine-coded hierarchy and domination they believe are natural.
The first thing that you might want to note about postmodernism is that it doesn't have a shred of gratitude. And there's something pathologically wrong with a person who doesn't have any gratitude, especially when they live in what so far is the best of all possible worlds.
Their arguments basically just collapse back into the same old biological essentialism and naturalism. Men are meant to rule, hierarchies are inevitable, power is destiny.
You have an ancient counter in your brain, and that was the point of the biological comparisons, lobsters being one set of comparisons, but not only lobsters. We know perfectly well, animal behaviorists, people who know their neuropsychopharmacology, know perfectly well that the serotonergic system operates quite similarly across most animals with complex nervous systems, and one of the things that it does is track relative status position.
The problem becomes when
postmodernism
becomes an aesthetic style in and of itself, one that tears down meaning without offering anything new in its place. That's why it works so well as the cultural logic of late-stage capitalism, something that the wonderful Michael Burns discussed in one of his own recent videos that you can go to check out more on. But late-stage capitalism likes to take stories that it owns, strip away their history and context, and then sell people back the hollow shell of what they loved. It's why we live in an age of endless reboots, remakes, and franchises. It's all empty signifiers without understanding the signified. People will still feel emotionally attached to a meaning of a story that they watched when they were younger before they go and watch the new, Lilo and Stitch movie, but the substance, the reason that you cared in the first place with the new version of the thing, is gone. What's left is just recycled aesthetics. Nothing can ever be sincere. It all has to be filtered through some level of irony, which we see here in Pelia's constant undercutting of the drama of a moment for a quick little ironic comedy bit that would better fit in the MCU.
If any of those things ever escape that well down there, God help us all. You want one for the camera?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
It's nostalgia as an endless feedback loop that never allows itself to say anything meaningful because it realizes that it is an insincere product. This is why we keep getting multiverse gimmicks and crossover everything events, your Space Jam 2s, your MCU's endless remix saga, take your pick. All of these things are just recycled out of their context, just sold back to you without any meaning to them. And these spectacles function as what Jean Baudrillard might call simulacra, stories stripped of their specificity, endlessly recycled as signs in and of themselves. In Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation, he argued that when a symbol is repeated enough times, it becomes detached from the reality it once referenced. The sign stops pointing to any material history and instead only points to other signs, a simulation of meaning that has no real meaning unto itself. Think of Disney castles or the Wild West as it exists in Hollywood movies. These aren't depictions of actual history, they're depictions of depictions, copies of copies. Studios strip stories of their meaning so they can mash them together in a nostalgic smoothie where the specificity of any tale doesn't matter because it can just be recycled, reskinned, and resold. They're no longer pointing back to any original context, they only reference each other. The result is a cultural logic of repetition where meaning collapses into aesthetic gestures. Recognition replaces resonance. Strange New Worlds is exactly this nostalgic machine. Take Wedding Bell Blues again, which ends with the reveal that Rhys Darby was actually Trelane the whole time, the godlike character who appeared in the original series episode, The Squire of Gothos.
1, 2, 3, 4, gehen wir mit den Schiffsgewehr.
And literally end Wedding Bell Blues the exact same way as The Squire of Gothos, with an energy being showing up to scold Trelane as their child.
What is this?
Not now, Dad.
Oh, you have made enough of a mess. Please, let's not make a scene.
Just there for the audience to go, oh yeah, I remember that scene. That was a good one. But strips away what made that original ending meaningful. In The Squire of Gothos, Trelane wasn't just some bratty godling. He had been watching humanity for centuries through a telescope and had fallen in love with our violent past of war, conquest, and empire. Like a dad binging Tom Hanks' World War II movies.
And this, of course, is an array of your battle flags and pennants, dating back to the Crusades, to Hannibal's invaders, the Grecian war galleys, and the hordes of Persia. Can't you imagine it, Captain? The thousands of men marching off to their deaths, singing beneath these banners. Doesn't it make your blood run swiftly?
And his costume was him cosplaying as Napoleon.
Ah, monsieur, vive la gloire, vive Napoleon. You know, I admire your Napoleon very much.
But because of his distance to Earth and the delay in light reaching him, Trelane assumed Kirk and his crew were still those same warlike beings because he was currently watching it through his telescope. And he kept trying to push Kirk and the crew to indulge his barbaric fantasies for his amusement.
If it's fighting that you want, you may have it.
Are you challenging me to a duel?
If you have the courage.
Oh, this is better than I'd planned. I shall not shirk an affair of honor.
But Kirk refuses again and again, insisting that humanity has moved beyond treating violence as its preferred option.
I want to know all about your campaigns, your battles, your missions of conquest.
Our missions are peaceful, not for conquest. When we do battle, it is only because we have no choice.
But that's the official story, eh?
The reveal that Trelane at the end of the episode is just a child by God standards is the thematic kicker to the entire point. The idea that glorifying war and violence is a childish impulse, even, maybe especially, when done by someone with immense power.
We said, come along.
But I haven't finished studying my predators yet.
This is not studying them.
If you cannot take proper care of your pets, you cannot have them at all.
Oh, but I was winning.
They're beings, Trelane. They have spirit. They're superior.
No, you saw.
In fact, crucially, Trelane's power in the episode is not Q space magic. It's caused by technology hidden behind a mirror, which is a meaningful reference to the Wizard of Oz that understands what that sign is in that work while also pointing at it. The message is sly, but very, very clear. Advanced technology in and of itself doesn't equal enlightenment, which challenged the logic that European colonizers weaponized that argued that their industrial progress was proof of their inherent superiority over their colonized subjects. Again, Star Trek questioning the norms of its current age. It may not be the deepest Star Trek episode, but its message is firmly in the Roddenberry ethos of humanity doesn't grow up into a better society simply by acquiring more power or better toys and technology. We have to choose to grow up ourselves. Wedding Bell Blues, though, throws out all of that context. It never gives us a justification for why Trelane wanted to mess with Spock in the first place. Now he just does.
Well, look at that. My own little Vulcan terrarium. My friends will be so jealous.
His Napoleonic outfit is now just a sign of his flamboyance, not a symbol pointing to actual history that signified his veneration of violence. Instead, we get John Delancey himself coming in to voice Trelane's parent, which officially confirmed a decades-old fan theory that Trelane was secretly a Q all along.
You're a child?
A very young one. Only 8,000 of your Earth years.
8,020, Dad.
It's time to go.
A theory that has literally existed since before Q even debuted, when writer DC Fontana told Roddenberry he was basically just recreating Trelane as he was writing his sections of the Next Generation pilot Encounter at Farpoint that introduced the character of Q.
All it takes are a few good men.
What? That nonsense is centuries behind us.
But you can't deny that you're still a dangerous, savage child race.
Most certainly I deny it.
But it ignores that the fact that Trelane's power was not space magic, but actually technology, actually was an important point in the episode. On top of that, fans themselves made the connection and debated it for decades, so much so that the late, great, and amazing author Peter David even ran with it in his wonderfully bonkers novel Q Squared, which is where that fan theory should have stayed, in a tie-in novel. As a result, Strange New Worlds' reveal feels like the writers weren't really interested in using Trelane for anything more than finally checking off a favorite fan theory of theirs and getting to redo a scene that they liked from the original series again. What was once a pointed parable about violence, technology, and maturity gets flattened into hollow nostalgia, stripped down to aesthetic. It's not saying anything new, it's just recycling a gag that Futurama already did with a funnier subversion in its own Trek parody 20 years ago.
Malvar! Dinner time!
But Mom! I'm playing with my collectibles!
No! All this time we thought he was a powerful super being, yet he was just a child.
He's not a child, he's 34!
And nowhere is this nostalgia strip mining clearer than with the Gorn. Don't know why I said it that way. In the original series episode Arena, Starfleet and Kirk assume the Gorn are attacking Federation outposts out of sheer aggression because they're monstered lizard people. What else are they gonna do?
You allude to invasion, Captain. Yet positive proof has...
I have all the proof I need on Cestus 3.
Not necessarily, sir. Several possible explanations come...
How can you explain a massacre like that? No, Mr. Spock. The threat is clear and immediate.
But by the end of the episode, Kirk learns that the Gorn were simply defending their territory after Starfleet unknowingly settled in it. So, when the godlike Metrons beam Kirk down to Vasquez Rocks for some lizard wrestling to settle their differences with violence, and Kirk wins, he refuses to kill the Gorn captain.
No, I won't kill him. Do you hear?
Showing that he actually has empathy for the Gorn, despite them looking like a lizard rubber man who moves and sounds like me the day after I went to the gym for the first time in a month, but am trying to hide it. And the Federation actually backs off, leaving Gorn territory alone. It's an allegory for settler colonialization, for how America displaced indigenous peoples, then branded them as savages when they dared to fight back. It was dehumanizing them as other in order to justify us taking their land. The point Star Trek was making was that the monster is never really the monster. The monster is the story we tell about people that we see as other, the mask we force onto others to excuse our own violence. And that an actual improved human civilization like the Federation would choose not to do that colonizing shit when they're confronted with the fact that they're doing it.
What happened to the Gorn?
I sent him back to his ship. If you like, I shall destroy him for you.
No, that won't be necessary. We can talk. Maybe reach an agreement.
Very good, Captain. There is hope for you.
But for 3 seasons now, Strange New Worlds has turned the Gorn into bargain bin xenomorphs, now complete with Mass Effect 2 style layers where they eat people, I guess, stripping any of these signifiers from their original metaphorical depth and context, like Aliens' commentary on sexual violation and corporate exploitation. Instead, they're just portrayed as the literal monsters that we were shown that they weren't in the original series. Strange New Worlds Season 3 opener is just a riff on The Next Generation's Best of Both Worlds, where Riker beats the Borg by using Picard's sleep command.
Sleep. Data.
With here Pike using solar radiation to lure the Gorn home like they're moths to a bug zapper. But unlike the Borg, this makes no sense if the Gorn are a warp-capable species. How would these beings, who apparently have the ability to make these huge technological ships, just be controlled by their biology? Oh yeah. But all of this makes perfect sense if you're just writing the Gorn as dumb monsters. Akiva Goldsman even admitted at Tribeca Film Festival this year that his obsession with the Gorn was about retconning them into being real monsters.
What we do in Star Trek is that we start by seeing the other, and often we end by engaging our empathy and understanding common ground. That's great, but it doesn't mean there isn't real evil in the world. And so what we wanted to do with the Gorn is give you a monster that at least at first seemed irredeemable.
It seems Goldman was excited to use the Gorn in his prequel because he could then just use them as simple monsters of the week, because the Federation didn't know that they weren't actually monsters at this point. That he could use them as real evil that we don't have to understand. An idea that he seems weirdly obsessed with. Hold on to that, we'll come back to that later on in this video.
I think it's safe to say that we don't understand the Gorn.
Well, I've seen them up close and personal, and they're not hard to understand, Bob. They're monsters.
Monsters are a word to describe those who don't understand us.
And sometimes a monster's just a monster.
Now, to give credit where it's due, the best episode of the season actually finally does break this down. Episode 9, Terrarium, finally gives us our Mortagus episode. Melissa Navia has been killing it as Ortegas since season 1, so much so that we were actually promised an Ortegas-focused episode last season, but that one just turned out to be the Mimi I Fly the Ship episode.
I'm America Ortegas. I fly the ship. Fly the ship? I am Erica Ortegas. I fly the ship. I am Erica Ortegas. I fly the ship.
Where Ortegas' character arc is that she learns the deeply status quo lesson that you should just be happy with your assigned role in society and never try to break out and do anything else.
When you do the same thing every day, it's easy to forget how important that thing is, how awesome that thing is. I won't let that happen again. I'm Erica Ortegas, and I fly the ship.
Which again, feels like a very anti-Star Trek message, where Star Trek usually says, find who best you are and society will try to enable it. This is something that we saw in Lower Decks' second ever episode, where we had the character of Rutherford, who was an engineer on the Cerritos, wanting to try out different jobs on the ship, and instead of getting angry at him, most people just enabled him to try to seek out what identity fits him best.
I'd like to request a transfer out of engineering.
Consider your request granted! Oh man, this is exciting. I'm sure wherever you end up, they'll be lucky to have you.
Aw, thanks guys!
Even though he finally settled on the idea that he did like being an engineer.
My heart's in engineering. I'd like permission to leave the Bear Pack.
Rutherford, that is outstanding! Gotta be true to yourself. Am I right, Bears?
It's something I wish we allowed more people in our society to do, especially straight and cis people. Even if they end up deciding that they're straight and cis, they should be able to feel comfortable to explore what they like, and it gives them more confidence in their own identity, without having them to force themselves to fit a role. But anyways, that's last season's problems. This season though, the writers still seem unsure what to do with Ortegas beyond giving her PTSD related to her Gorn encounter in the season premiere, which itself is a reiterative character beat of La'an's Gorn trauma. Which is very funny, by the way, because the wonderful author James Swallow, just before season 3 came out, released a novel that focused on Ortegas that actually gave her a really rich backstory. I highly recommend it. Still, Ortegas' PTSD does lead to some solid material, like in episode 3, where she's insubordinate because she hasn't yet figured out how to reconnect and work with others after trauma has rewired how she thinks.
This can't ever happen again. You do realize that, right?
I do.
But then comes Terrarium. Ortegas crash lands on a planet with a female Gorn, who I'm just gonna call Sigourney, because alien. Get it? And the two of them have to team up to survive. Yes, it's basically Trek doing the Enemy Mine episode yet again, since TNG, DS9, and Enterprise have all done this episode before, which is again Strange New World just cribbing from other Trek episodes that themselves were just cribbing from movies. But this cribbing is actually done well because it has something to say within this show's context by adding in its own subversions. Unlike most Enemy Mine setups, where both characters from opposing cultures start off hostile to each other, Sigourney immediately shows kindness, saving Ortegas' life, even giving her some of her food, while it's only Ortegas who projects fear and assumes Sigourney wants to eat her.
What is this? A trap? I go for the meat, you grab me, pull my legs off?
Sigourney herself makes very clear that she doesn't view Ortegas as prey, but as an enemy that she seeks to understand.
You study your prey.
Disagree.
You want to understand your enemy.
Agree.
Suddenly, Sigourney is embodying Starfleet's values more than Ortegas is, or most of our Starfleet characters have towards the Gorn, like Pike, who usually treat the Gorn as just monsters. And there's even more depth here too, because Sigourney is actually injured while helping Ortegas, and we learn that if her people ever found her, they'd kill her because she was weak due to her injury.
You think you're too broken to fix. I've seen the Gorn destroy their own ship because they thought it was weak. So for you, rescue's a death sentence.
And that's actually interesting world building. It finally gives Gorn society something tangible beyond them being mindless monsters, showing that they have a culture of some sort that is, unfortunately, violently ableist and rooted in might makes right mentality, but it's still something. And it also humanizes Sigourney herself as someone who is othered now, because of her disability, within her own culture. We're starting to see how Gorn culture and all Gorn themselves are not one and the same. On top of that, Sigourney and Ortegas have incredible chemistry together. They even play board games together, which is peak Trek cultural exchange. Though Ortegas teaching a Gorn chess in 2 days is bold. Though, not to toot my own horn of candor, but I literally did a skit in my Strange New World Season 2 review video where I played chess against a Gorn and also had incredible chemistry with them. Oh, this feels good. Oh, I like that. Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is great. Oh my gosh. Oh, that you know how to touch me, Gorny. You do. Oh, yeah. Oh. So, who's stealing from who here? But jokes aside, seriously, I kind of ship Sigourney and Ortegas. As a Mass Effect Shep Garrus shipper, I am here for space monster love. I mean, if Spock can hook up with half the galaxy, let Ortegas have her big lizard girlfriend. At least then we'd finally get a non-heteronormative relationship on this damn show. Basically, what I'm saying is, please send me your Gorntegas erotica. I want it. I need it. Point is, despite recycling a tried and true formula, Terrarium finally treats the Gorn as more than monsters by fleshing out their culture and humanizing someone who both represents and is marginalized within it. It only took Strange New Worlds 3 seasons to do what the original series managed to do better in a single episode, but hey, at least it got there. It's the best episode of the season by a wide margin. Until the ending. The episode ends with Lon beaming down to save Ortegas from the planet, and upon seeing the Gorn in what is one of the most obvious setups in the entire history of Star Trek, just shoots Sigourney dead.
Are you alright?
Why?
Lieutenant!
Oh no.
I watched the scene with my fiance, who is no longer in the room, so we can talk about her as much as we want to, and she was actually devastated by this ending because she really loved Sigourney and Ortegas' relationship. To give it credit, I get that that emotion is what the episode was going for, and I don't entirely hate the concept of it. The episode is trying to show that humanity of the era of Strange New Worlds still has a bit to learn in order to reach the more mature version of ourselves we see just a few years later in universe in Arena, represented by Captain Kirk. And I actually like when Star Trek says we're still flawed human beings working to do better, even though we live in a society that enables us to reach for our better selves more often. This is actually a decent-ish use of the prequel setting to arc towards the original series. The problem here, though, to me, is several-fold. First is how the episode uses La'an here. La'an has been written since season 1 as someone with deep internalized trauma towards the Gorn over some trauma she experienced from them as a child. What this scene implies is that we're meant to assume her trigger-happy choice to shoot Sigourney without asking questions comes out of that trauma. But it's worth noting that the 2 episodes just before Terrarium this season frame La'an in a very specific way. In the episode What is Starfleet, 2 episodes before this one, La'an is portrayed as a space cop who's trained to see every situation as a threat, especially when it comes to the Gorn. She's ready to kill first and ask questions later.
The weapons Enterprise carries are primarily defensive. Our goal is to not have to use them. That doesn't mean we don't fight back if we have to.
If you were to encounter a ship you fought with before, like the Gorn, would you fire first?
Unless you can kill them first, the best move is to run.
In the episode immediately prior to this one, 4.5 Vulcans, she's shown as genetically predisposed to preemptive violence. Given that context, La'an's instinct to shoot first in this scene comes across to me like a cop who pulls the trigger because they've been repeatedly trained to see themselves as heroes in an action movie and to expect danger and threats to their lives, and conditioned by cultural biases to see people that have been racialized as more monstrous as more prone to violence and thus more likely to hurt them. Which is exactly what happens here with the Gorn. But again, I wouldn't mind the show doing that if it was going to wrestle with it. But La'an is never disciplined, we don't see her even feeling bad or apologize for what happens, and she doesn't even express moral conflict after learning that Sigourney was peaceful. I mean, why was her phaser even set to kill on what was supposed to be a rescue mission on an empty planet in the first place? The only follow-up we get to the scene is Ortega's wrestling briefly with her conflicted feelings about Sigourney and her friendship with La'an, and then it's dropped.
She was my friend. La'an is my friend too. I don't know what to do with that.
Framed this way, it veers dangerously close to apologizing for killer cops, especially given the context the show itself established around La'an just over the past 2 episodes. And again, this would be slightly more forgivable in an episode of 1960s Star Trek, but it's even more egregious now when we've spent years openly having conversations about the role of policing. How it isn't a neutral keep people safe force, but one that functions to uphold the state and protect property over human life. I mean, I was quite literally kettled by the police just a few months ago while attending a protest against ICE raids here in Los Angeles. Star Trek through La'an, though, could have shown us a different version of security and policing that we've been discussing for years at this point. One that shows La'an challenging the assumptions behind policing, and one that actually reacts with empathy, or actually has social workers show up instead of, people with guns. And we could have done this with La'an wrestling with her trauma with the Gorn, overcoming her feelings about the Gorn while still trying to be a good security officer. To me, the best security officers are the ones who try to de-escalate. Shout out to my boy Tuvok. Even other Star Trek security officers like Odo and Worf had arcs where their instinctual suspicion of others was challenged, even as their aggression was, like La'an as an augment, problematically tied to their biology as a changeling and a Klingon.
I was just about to arrest these criminals.
I should arrest you for interfering in my investigation.
Will someone tell me what is going on here?
But instead, because the writers are obsessed with preserving nostalgia, they arc La'an towards just reacting on her trauma, genetics, and trained cop-like instincts to kill a Gorn, all just to presumably preserve the continuity of the fact that the Federation didn't know that the Gorn weren't monsters, without the show ever reflecting on that decision. Funny, the cops interrupt me on that line. I think this is retaliation, folks. My second problem, though, is the narrative choice to kill Sigourney at all. But it also leans right into the outdated trope that othered figures' stories always end in suffering, pain, or death. This is a common framing of stories around othered people. Take the infamous bury your gays trope. Under the Hollywood Hays Code, queer characters throughout Hollywood history in the 40s into the 60s literally had to die or be punished for breaking sexual norms. Even after the Hays Code went away, that trope morphed into queer and trans characters dying so audience could see them as tragic. The audience just sigh and go, oh, look how tragic those poor queers' lives are. Makes me sad. Wish I could do anything about it. And this hasn't gone away. Hell, it's still winning Oscar nominations. See my video on the clusterfuck that was Amelia fucking Perez.
Men to woman, or woman to men.
Man to woman.
From penis to vagina.
The result is that we rarely get to see ourselves simply living or having stories or even a future that isn't defined by trauma, tragedy, or death. And certainly, we've gotten more stories of queer people throughout the years, so the problem of bury your gays is less of an issue. However, when we allegorize it and make it about an othered people generally speaking, it tends to reinforce the problem, which is what's happening here with the Gorn. It reduces other people to objects of pity, people whose worth is proven only when we're sacrificed because we don't fit in. It's empathy through tragedy. And so the problem here with the Gorn is not that it's representing the bury your gays trope or anything like that. I want to be very clear. I'm not offended as a queer person over the killing of this space lizard person. What I am saying is that it's a very outdated and tropey version of how to tell stories about othered people. And it's ultimately regressive in very particular ways. Because yes, these stories are written as a way to inspire people to have a desire to change societies so marginalized people can live. At least that's their intent. But it's also always reactive. It means that change should only come after there's a body count. And the constant repetition of stories like these breeds that sense of inevitability, as if this is where all marginalized stories must end. And that's something that I want Star Trek to not replicate. Star Trek should be something about showing a future where marginalized people get to live as part of the story. Sigourney may be a fictional alien, but she's also a disabled character marked as other by her own society as well, and her death falls back on the same outdated tropes that use pain as a shortcut for empathy instead of daring to imagine a life past tragedy. Philosopher Judith Butler calls this idea ungrievability. Lives that are already seen as lost, already diminished, never fully belonging to humanity. It's why so many centrists can say they support trans people while doing nothing as fascists legislate us out of existence. They already assume our lives are doomed. They don't feel an impetus to try to change anything about the situation for us because this is where we're supposed to be, isn't it? They'll feel bad when we die, but they won't try to do anything to change the circumstances that cause us to die in the first place. It's also why Palestinians can be slaughtered en masse and still be talked about by those who understand what's happening as a genocide as if their deaths were inevitable rather than preventable, which they are. And to be clear, ungrievability does not mean that literally no one mourns a person. It means that people from that group's deaths are treated as routine, as not worth reckoning with. Sigourney shows this. Ortegas feels a flicker of sadness for her, yes, but also has sympathy for her killer. La'an is shown to feel nothing. And Starfleet and the Federation never acknowledge Sigourney, and the Gorn hegemony won't either. And as a result, her life just slips away. A momentary pang of sadness before we're then nudged to cheer for the setup for future Star Trek stories where Kirk gets it right. Yay, look at the nostalgia! You forgot about feeling bad about Sigourney. Star Trek has always been at its most unique when it dares to imagine a better way, a more inclusive society, one that creates space for the marginalized and the othered, rather than insisting that they don't belong. Imagine if Sigourney had been rescued by Starfleet, forcing Pike and the crew to confront their own biases around the Gorn while realizing at the same time that they couldn't just return her to her people without condemning her to death. That's a messy, complicated story that I would have loved to see in a Star Trek show. It also could have given Ortegas more time to build a more complicated relationship with Sigourney and deal with her PTSD with the Gorn. Hell, maybe even develop a romantic relationship, if the writers weren't cowards, and advocate for Sigourney's place within the Federation. Instead, because this is a prequel obsessed with justifying TOS canon and can't have the Gorn join the crew, we get the least interesting, most trope-ridden option. Because again, the show tips its hand when it drags the Metron back on stage for no reason except, hey, remember Arena? Except instead of praising Kirk's empathy here, the Metron lectures Ortegas about how humanity still needs to learn empathy, and then erases her memory anyway, so what was the fucking point?
What are they telling you?
You are not ready to meet us. You won't remember me.
It's just an unneeded cameo, pure reference for reference sake. And the Metron even says,
and perhaps someday, we may need to reset your perception of the Gorn as well.
Which, oh god, is clearly there as an in-universe explanation for why the Gorn looks like a guy in the rubber suit in the original series. And I groaned so hard. We don't need lore for the rubber suit. It was the 1960s. That was the charm. I miss when sci-fi didn't have to be this high-budget spectacle justifying itself. I wish I could just have, you know, my sci-fi be like its community theater held together with like spit and baling wire, exploring new, interesting ideas. It's okay for art to ask us to suspend disbelief, to ask us to engage with it, rather than demand constant verisimilitude that encourages passive consumption. But this need to explain everything treats Trek not as art to wrestle with, but as an in-canon sacred text, where every rubber suit demands explanation instead of just being part of the medium's charm. That's postmodernism at work, stripping the piece from the cultural context in which it was made and turning it into nothing but reference. The Gorn suit can't simply read as a product of 1960s television's limitations. It must now be explained by a non-binary space god. It asks us to read the text as divorced from the world that produced it and instead fold it back into itself. And as a result, it actively makes the original Arena worse. It implies the Metron in that episode made the Gorn captain look more human to Kirk, and that's why Kirk empathized with him. Which completely undercuts the point. The whole point was you should empathize with beings even who don't look like you.
I seem to have an instinctive revulsion to reptiles. I must fight to remember that this is an intelligent, highly advanced individual, the captain of a starship like myself.
One of the original series' best episodes, The Devil in the Dark, is literally about Kirk and Spock realizing that the monster of that episode, the Horta, was just a mother protecting her young, and challenging us to respect her personhood despite her looking completely alien.
The Horta is intelligent, peaceful, mild. She had no objection to sharing this planet with you until you broke into her nursery and started destroying her eggs. Then she fought back in the only way she knew how, as any mother would fight when her children are endangered.
We didn't know. How could we?
By contrast, Strange New World basically assumes humans can't empathize unless we're tricked into seeing ourselves reflected in something. As a trans femme non-binary person constantly told that I should conform to look more like a real woman to be accepted, I find that message regressive and dangerous. Unless you say, Jesse, you're reading way too much into this one line from the Metron. And this theme of empathy being reserved for only those who look recognizable to us also shows up in what's probably the season's second best episode, The Ceylon Who Ate Its Tail. In that episode, Kirk saves the Enterprise and a colony of millions from a scavenger ship crew of 70,000 people by blowing it up. And we're told that these scavengers weren't also going to be responsible for the Enterprise's death and the colony of millions that they were about to attack, but also responsible for the deaths of millions and even entire planetary genocides for centuries.
Scavenger ship, hundreds of years old, prowling just beyond the edges of known space.
Consuming resources from planets and any ship unlucky enough to cross its path.
These were pretty awful fucking people. The twist turns out to be that the scavengers are actually descendants of human astronauts who fled Earth's climate crisis centuries ago, right before what was in universe World War III, believing themselves to be the last hope for humanity.
It barely put out the fires of the Third World War. One of the few nations left standing sifted through the ashes of their space program, scoured the world for a crew. You might say they were the best of us.
But instead, they and their descendants end up just consuming and consuming for its own sake at the cost of human lives.
You just found their weakness. Their ravenous need to consume. Bottomless greed.
This is actually a solid kernel of commentary here. These astronauts are basically SpaceX cosplayers, echoing the mindset of modern-day capitalist tech oligarchs like Elon Musk, who see endless growth as an end in and of itself, no matter the human or ecological cost. That's a really strong idea, and by far the most overt attempt at a modern political message in this season of Strange New Worlds. And while I do like it, the episode doesn't actually really explore it. It just kind of tosses it out at the end. The result feels less like a fully developed story and more like a middling Next Generation episode that remembers to tack on a message in the final 5 minutes. Instead, the episode's main focus is on Kirk's character arc throughout the episode, on learning that he needs to become a leader, ending with Pike consoling a conflicted Kirk who's upset about having killed the crew of the scavenger ship, telling him empathy is a choice and we should always try to understand our enemies.
Empathy isn't conditional, it's either given or it isn't. They clearly saw us. And either they didn't recognize us or they didn't care. Whatever journey they'd been through the last 200 years, it broke them.
When they left Earth, they were the best humanity had to offer. They weren't monsters. Is that what we would become in the same circumstances?
I'd like to believe we wouldn't.
That message is a little rich coming from the guy who keeps calling the Gorn monsters, but it's still a good message. The problem with this, though, is that we're shown that Kirk feels this huge crisis of conscience about killing the people of the scavenger ship more deeply, specifically because the astronauts turned out to be humans.
They were human beings. Why does that make it feel so much worse?
Which is bizarre for a guy who grew up in a multicultural federation and has canonically slept with half the galaxy, but apparently empathy only really kicks in when the enemy looks like him, I guess. Again, it's empathy being reserved for the familiar, not the different, just like the Metron stuff with the Gorn. Now, I'm not saying Kirk should have been gleeful about the killing of 7,000 people, but he literally was trying to save other people's lives, and it's disturbing that the show asks me, the audience, to spend more time agonizing over the deaths of space capitalist death cultists who murdered millions and were about to murder millions more than it ever lets me empathize with, say, the Gorn. It's Strange New Worlds once again reflecting our own society rather than challenging it. The same logic has been playing out in our world today. Charlie Kirk has been given a literal national holiday. His death has been turned into a spectacle that the nation is literally forced to grieve or else. Yet this is a man who blamed the, quote, decline of American men on transgender equality, and who said trans people should have been, quote, taken care of the way we used to in the 1950s or 60s. As reporter Aaron Reed has pointed out, that meant lobotomies, shock therapy, and forced institutionalization for trans people, while police also labeled queer people at the time a cancer in the community and encouraged violence against us. Charlie Kirk also called trans people an abomination and a, quote, throbbing middle finger to God. So when political leaders praise him as civil or call us to continue his work, they are honoring the normalization of violence against us. Just as Strange New Worlds directs our sympathy towards La'an and her role as a cop, or towards these men who were supposedly the future of our society, our real-world society insists we grieve men like Kirk while treating trans lives and other marginalized peoples as disposable. Our deaths vanish without recognition, while the man who helped to normalize our erasure is enshrined with reverence. We're often told to recognize the humanity of those in power who reflect the supposed default and the best of us, the Elon Musks or Charlie Kirks of the world, while those who are othered or marginalized are ignored, reduced to tragedy, or outright vilified, especially when we dare to speak out against power and the status quo that harms us. But I will say, episode 6 of the season ends up being the second best episode of the season, not because it has a bold political message, though I do like that part of it, but because its nostalgia at least feels somewhat intentional. Like the writers actually wanted to say something about the in-universe toys that they love, instead of just bolting those toys onto tired stereotypical plots. Because most of the episode focuses on Paul Wesley's Kirk taking command of the Farragut for the first time, with the crew of the original series being on his ship who are actually there to openly question his leadership style. That's actually a solid prequel angle, showing Kirk before he's the risk is our business captain, still learning and growing. Martin Quinn's Scotty in particular especially stands out as he has been this entire season, bringing a blunt, skeptical energy that clashes with Kirk in a way that really works.
I understand. I'm not sure you do. You were handed a raw deal, alright? No one can fault you for that. But if we push this ship too hard and it fails, that's our fault, not theirs.
It's a risk. But
I am betting on us.
And also, honestly, Wesley really nails his take on Kirk here too, matching Shatner's bravado and intelligence without engaging in parody like he'd been asked to do in A Space Adventure Hour, while also adding his own hint of insecurity to his version of Kirk.
Well, then I need you to perform some miracles, Mr. Scott. We need engines and weapons in that order. Patch up the wounded. Get them back to work as soon as you can. We need to figure out where that scavenger ship is headed so we can find a way to get there first. That's it. Let's get going.
However, and I hate that I have to add a however here, I wish I could just praise this episode completely, the point of Kirk's arc ends up being Spock basically telling him, just act confident, take action for action's sakes, and you'll figure it out.
Your human intuition. It has guided us this far. We are all still here. I recommend you keep following it.
Which, to me, kind of misunderstands Kirk. He was never just the brash, decide and do it guy. To me, he always came across in the original series as a thoughtful, well-read guy who was willing to listen to Spock and others before acting. But that contrast stands out even more when you look at Pike, who's repeatedly been framed throughout this season and even slightly before it as indecisive. Take how Pike literally learns in an episode that Mbenga murdered a Klingon ambassador on Pike's ship, and Pike just shrugs and says, you're my friend, I just wish you'd told me.
Are you going to turn me in? Are you worried I will? That depends on who I'm talking to right now. My friend or my captain? Look, I understand why you didn't tell me certain things, and I just wish I'd known some of them sooner.
Instead of having an interesting perspective on his decision, either agreeing or disagreeing with Mbenga and expressing such. That would have been an interesting, thing to write. The show just seems to think Mbenga being a murderer who kills for morally gray reasons is deep, but it really isn't because it repeatedly refuses to engage with the questions that raises.
Have you ever scrubbed the surveillance logs from sickbay?
I cannot recall. I cannot recall.
Either commit to it, give us a morally gray story, or drop it. But compare Pike's lack of any feeling, let alone complicated conflicting ones, about Mbenga's actions as either his captain or as a friend, to Captain Sisko in the Season 4 Deep Space Nine episode, Rules of Engagement. There, as Worf's commanding officer, Sisko defends him as his advocate during an extradition trial where Worf is accused of negligence leading to Klingon civilians' deaths. But once they win, Sisko privately tears into him for endangering civilians in the first place.
But you're a Starfleet officer, Worf. We don't put civilians at risk or even potentially at risk to save ourselves. Sometimes that means we lose the battle, and sometimes our lives. But if you can't make that choice, then you can't wear that uniform.
That's a character with interesting points of view, unlike Pike, who just goes, wish you had told me. As a result, Pike, a character that I usually like, ends up looking spineless. His collaborative command style, which is something that I loved when he showed up in Star Trek Discovery asking for crews' names without rank.
Ord knows what's waiting for us down there. I want to know who I'm facing it with. Sound off. And skip your ranks, they don't matter. Clockwise from science.
Or even in this season's episode Terrarium, where he balances Una's pragmatism with Uhura's hope in order to save Ortegas.
Captain, a reminder. We are scheduled to rendezvous with the Constellation to deliver a vaccine to the colonists on Epsilon Indy 3. They are fighting off a pandemic.
We need to keep trying.
Hey. No one's giving up yet. We still have time to explore more avenues. Let's make the best of it.
He's constantly set up in contrast to Strange New Worlds' version of Kirk's bold decisiveness. Hell, the moral of Season 1's finale was basically Pike's cautious empathy would have doomed the Federation to war, while Kirk's brash risk-taking saves the day. Compare this to Star Trek Discovery's recent 5th season, which actually interrogated these conflicting command styles. We were shown Michael Burnham's empathetic leadership style, but it was weighed against Captain Rayner's blunt authoritarian leadership style.
There's no time to be collaborative, there's time to be decisive and disciplined.
You don't think my crew is disciplined?
I think they're too familiar, too comfortable with each other, and frankly with you.
That familiarity helped us save the Federation, the galaxy, And you?
I'm not doubting their resumes or yours. But none of you had to learn the lessons that we did during the burn. Things change like that. And if I listened to every opinion and cheered on anyone who had an idea, me and my crew would have been dead 100 times over.
While Star Trek Discovery ultimately favored Burnham, it also acknowledged Raynor's strengths in the moment.
Truth be told, I can be stubborn. Like you used to be.
You know, I still am. Just in a different way. Seeing her was a really good reminder. You know, we are always changing. With everything that happens to us, with the choices we make, what's meaningful to us. I get that being here and the way you came here, it's a big adjustment. But I think we made a pretty good team today.
That's nuance that says there is a place for both leadership styles in different contexts. Strange New Worlds, though, skips all of that and just stacks the deck so Kirk's bold, authoritative style is always right. And ends up reassuring the audience that what humanity really needs is a good, strong man at the top, without ever questioning if maybe the whole structure of strongman leadership is actually the problem. Though, maybe this downgrade of Captain Pike isn't the biggest loss in the world, because, well, Anson Mount has lately been out here doing both sides-ism around both Israel and Charlie Kirk's death, and even recently shared some weird AI slop video that literally turned his Star Trek co-stars into hot bimbos, which kind of makes the treatment of Pike feel like a strange mirror of how compromised and muddled his real-world persona has been positioning himself lately. And this whole veneration of Kirk, by the way, as well as Episode 6's soft pilot setup with the original series crew on the Farragut under Kirk, clearly comes from Akiva Goldsman's stated desire to spin Strange New Worlds straight into a Star Trek Year 1 series, which would essentially be a show depicting Kirk's first year commanding the Enterprise with the exact same crew from the original series. Now, sure, you could argue that the show would be a little bit different because it would have an earlier arc for Kirk because it takes place just before the original series, but let's all just admit what it is. This would ultimately just come down to a predominantly redo of the original series. Hell, we just did that with the Kelvin timeline movies, and Paramount Skydance is still floating doing another one of those in the near future. So why would we also need a Year 1 show? Why must Trek endlessly circle Kirk and Spock like it's trapped in its own nostalgic gravity well without really understanding what makes Star Trek meaningful in the first place? All of this is why Trek desperately needs to move past prequels. For nearly 2 decades, it's been stuck in them over and over and over again. And while they can be done well, see Star Wars Andor, prequels are often where nostalgia thrives most dangerously. They often frame characters as fated for their future roles, suggesting that the future is inevitable rather than something that we have to imagine and fight for, constantly negotiating with.
Every time we change the path, he dies. He's got things to do. Fate of the galaxy type things.
And in doing so, these stories strip the original stories often of their context, flattening them into predetermined destiny rather than living, breathing visions of possibility. This is why, by the way, I'm genuinely intrigued for Star Trek Starfleet Academy. It's the furthest forward canon Trek has ever gone. It doesn't have to arc towards some fixed future, it can actually try doing something new. It can do things like have a Jem'Hadar, a species once engineered as super soldiers for the fascist Dominion in Deep Space Nine, within Starfleet now, which is actually using Trek's own history and context to ask how the Federation or others might have evolved over the years. It's reminiscent of how the Klingons were used in The Next Generation in Undiscovered Country, how they went from enemies of the Federation into allies, who we had tensions with and we had to grow past our biases towards, but someone that we could learn to integrate and understand.
People can be very frightened of change.
You've restored my father's faith.
And you've restored my son's.
Which was, by the way, an actually relevant political question of the time, considering the United States' relationship to the USSR, who the Klingons were usually allegorizing. And yet, the anti-woke outrage machine is already in overdrive over Starfleet Academy, frothing at the mouth over its diverse cast and younger target audience.
Star Trek Starfleet Academy from this teaser trailer looks pretty much exactly what I was expecting it to look like. Definitely high on the DEI. So
The Jem'Hadar instructor in particular has been plastered across hate-mongering YouTube thumbnails, mocked because female Jem'Hadar doesn't exist in Deep Space Nine. These writers don't understand canon. Despite the fact the show is set hundreds of years after Deep Space Nine, we can have a lady Jem'Hadar. Congratulations, you've recreated the Ka-Adi-Mundi's age on a trading card discourse. And if any of you out there don't know what I'm referring to there, don't worry, it was a stupid outrage cycle where grifters used an obscure canon nitpick around Star Wars The Acolyte in order to fuel a harassment campaign against its queer showrunners and marginalized leads. It probably doesn't hurt that the Jem'Hadar actress here in Starfleet Academy is a black woman either. Because most of these grifters are not actually angry about canon or even quality of these shows. It's mostly white Gen X men furious that a franchise they grew up with isn't tailored exclusively to them anymore. And they'll weaponize any nitpick, no matter how absurd, to reinforce norms of masculinity, whiteness, and control to their audience, who buy their explanation as the reason for any problem, real or imagined, with a show, franchise, or institution that they like. These grifters always frame it as an us versus them narrative, where diversity and inclusion get blamed for the hollowing out of culture, instead of the real culprit. Capitalism, late-stage capitalism, tokenizing marginalized identities as surface-level branding back in an era where diversity was a selling point, not like today unfortunately, while stripping away any of the politics or meaning that once gave these stories power and meaning in the first place. It's the same tactic they've been using for years. For every Star Wars show, for every Star Trek series or Marvel movie, they all turn it into culture war tantrums for clicks. And sure, to be clear, Starfleet Academy may suck. It's very possible it will. But these guys already have the narrative locked and loaded that anything which dares to feature new perspectives was doomed from the start because woke. And it's these same voices of endless agreement at any change to the status quo that might actually create a society that might be even slightly less uncomfortable for anyone besides them that fascists weaponize in order to reassert hierarchy. We'll be coming back to this point in just a little bit. Because this brings me back to Strange New Worlds, because that's the danger of hollowing out Star Trek through nostalgia. Once you strip these stories of their specificity or even basic tokenized diversity, they become blank myths, easy to retrofit into narratives of masculinity, nationalism, and empire. Star Trek, long treated as a kind of American myth, can be gutted of its critique of otherness, difference, and US imperialism, and repackaged as straight-up rah-rah patriotism in space under the guise of hopeful science fiction. And we're already seeing hints of that logic come into Strange New Worlds with episodes like, What is Starfleet? The episode What is Starfleet is framed as an in-universe documentary made by Beto, which, on paper, is actually a concept I really love for an episode. Beto even opens the documentary with interesting questions. Is Starfleet a military? A colonial power? What does it mean that a supposed vessel of peaceful exploration is bristling with phaser banks?
But what separates a federation from an empire? Both colonize. Both impose their laws and doctrines on others. Are they explorers as they claim, or soldiers as they appear?
These are open questions that have been had around Star Trek since its inception, even with its own creators, such as how Gene Roddenberry himself disliked movies like The Wrath of Khan for how Nicholas Meyer made it more military-inspired. And it brings to the fore one of the most basic questions of Star Trek. Is the Federation actually an imperial power reflective of our modern day, or is it truly trying to do something new and different? That's the core tension that has always existed within this franchise. But despite starting from an interesting place, as the episode goes on, it reveals that it never actually wanted to wrestle with those questions at all. And we can see that most obviously in the fact that it refuses to explore them with any specificity. The episode centers on Starfleet's involvement in a war between two civilizations, the Lutani and the Kassar. But we get almost no context for this conflict. All we're told in a text scroll on screen is that the Kassar attacked the Lutani to seize their system and resources, and that the Lutani have suffered far greater casualties. But why is this conflict happening in the first place? Are the Kassar an expansionist empire? Are they desperate for resources because their planet is running out or something? Are they trying to colonize the Lutani? Is this attack by the Kassar in retaliation for prior attacks by the Lutani? What is even the history between these two powers? We get the phrase that they're a sister planet, but what the hell does that even mean? Are these two planets in the same system? Were they originally one species that split off into two civilizations? Did one colonize the other in the past? Had they had peaceful relationships before this? We never find out any of that. And the problem that this creates is that by avoiding giving us any specifics, it means we as the audience have no clear way to judge or analyze Starfleet's actions within the conflict, which, given the opening of the episode, is seemingly what the documentary and the episode itself wants us to do. In fact, the episode makes a big deal about asking us to look at what Starfleet's doing within this conflict and come to some sense of moral judgment about it. We do learn that Starfleet ordered the Enterprise to aid the Lutani by transporting resources and a living being, the Jutara, for the Lutari, but the episode never explains why Starfleet chose to do this. Uhura and Ortegas argue that it's to provide aid to the Lutani during a war.
We received orders to transfer cargo to Lutani 7, a non-Federation world in need of aid and supplies, and that's what we're doing. What kind of supplies? Easy guess. They're at war.
But why does Starfleet, and more importantly the Federation as an institution, actually want to get involved? I mean, first and foremost, it's a blatant violation of the Prime Directive of non-interference, which never comes up, by the way, in the episode, strangely enough. So is Starfleet helping the Lutani because they think it's the morally right thing to do? Are they courting an alliance with the Lutani? Are they trying to expand the Federation's influence? Is it a mixture of all or none of these? We're never told, which, coupled with the lack of context for the war in the first place, again leaves us with no framework to assess Beto's accusation that Starfleet is enacting colonial violence, which is clearly the implication that Beto wants us to have as we watch the episode. He keeps returning to this implication through the tone and the questions that he asks the numerous characters in the show.
Have you ever refused an order?
Well, I think I can confidently say that that's classified.
Beto also makes a clear point that no one on the Enterprise, be it Uhura, Ortegas, or even Una or Pike, questions their orders enough to possibly not go through with them, even if they have clear doubts about what they're doing.
Do you believe in every mission?
Yes. I mean, of course I do.
Even after learning that the Jutara that they're trafficking is actually meant to be a living weapon that the Lutani plan to unleash on the Kassar, Starfleet still clearly orders Pike to deliver it. Meaning Starfleet knows they're trafficking weapons for one side of a conflict, and Pike and Una express concern over this, but still comply.
You know how I feel. It's irrelevant.
We have orders, whether we like it or not. Same goes for the crew as well.
No one tells you about this part of the job, do they?
And it is true that an unquestioning obedience to orders is exactly what can enable colonial violence, which the documentary framing clearly wants us to think might be possibly going on here. Even further, we see some Lutani scientists oppose the Juntara, literally trying to destroy it before it turns on them, nearly killing them. But the episode never explains why.
The Jukaru is a terrible, awful mistake.
It's okay.
We were wrong.
Are they upset by the ethics of how the Juntara was turned into a weapon? Something we'll learn more about later on this episode? Are they bothered by the cruelty of using a living being as a weapon just on its face? Or are they not worried about the Juntara at all, and simply more worried about the amount of sheer destruction that the Juntara could wreak on the Kassar? Is it all of the above? None of the above? Who the hell knows? 'Cause we sure don't! But eventually though, after a malfunction in its control collar forces Uhura and Spock to risk their lives to communicate with it directly, we learn that the Juntara is actually an intelligent, sentient being that was tortured by the Lutani into becoming a living weapon for their war with the Kassar. Even further, Mbenga tells us quite clearly that the Juntara has been tortured so much that it can only think in terms of violence, and that there is absolutely zero way to help it recover. That its change in mindset due to its torture is irreversible.
Her brain chemistry was artificially altered to focus solely on violence and destruction. Causes her great pain.
Can you reverse it?
No. She's still far gone.
And so the Juntara asks to die, begging the Enterprise to help it fly into a star, a request that Pike explicitly gets Starfleet's approval to grant.
I just spoke with Command. They weren't thrilled with me, but given the circumstances, we're in agreement now.
Lon, let's get her attention.
Already, all of this is a minefield. A storyline where a sentient being is so traumatized, sick, disabled, or mentally ill that they're damaged beyond recovery and seek death as their only option is, let's just say, fraught. The topic of assisted suicide in and of itself is one of the most complicated ethical subjects that you can touch upon. To me, people should have the right to make the choice for themselves, absolutely. But that also requires them to have informed consent, medical support, and dignity in being able to make that choice. And this is great to say in isolation, but in practice, the choice to go for assisted suicide or euthanasia is often shaped by the world around the people making that choice, rather than solely on their own desires and needs and pain. Conversations around euthanasia, or more accurately, the choice to not continue with medical care when people obviously need it, often happen inside a healthcare system that's designed less for care and more for how much blood can we squeeze from this stone before your deductible resets. The for-profit healthcare system that is rampant in this country often pushes people to choose to die rather than forcing upon their loved ones a bill that they'll probably spend the rest of their own lives paying back. So quite often when people say that they want to die, it's often not because their lives are inherently unlivable or can't be made to be such. It's because society won't provide the basic resources, support, or respect that would make living more comfortable and a reasonable option for them. To put it all another way, sometimes the problem is that we live in a world where Blue Cross Blue Shield would rather pay for your funeral than your wheelchair. And to be clear, Trek has actually handled this topic with nuance before. The Next Generation's Half a Life episode explored how societies pressure the elderly into viewing themselves as disposable simply because of their age.
I mean, he's not ill. He hasn't had a tragic accident. He's just going to die. And for no good reason. Because his society has decided that he's too old. So they just dispose of him. As though his life no longer had any value or meaning.
Well, Star Trek Voyager's Death Wish episode literally put the ethics of assisted suicide on trial.
If the path I choose leads to death, what right have they to interfere?
He's putting his selfish wishes above the welfare of everyone else.
And if I don't agree with the majority, I'm to be locked up for eternity.
You would not be confined if you were not intent on harming yourself.
Those stories didn't shy away from politics or philosophy around the topic. They made the ethics of euthanasia or assisted suicide the point.
I find it impossible to support immortality forced on an individual by the state. The unforeseen disruption that may occur in the continuum is not enough, in my opinion, to justify any additional suffering by this individual.
Here, by contrast, though, the Juntara is casually stamped unfixable because it can't think outside of violence anymore. That simplification clears the way for the episode to have an easy-out answer within the text of the episode, even though we also clearly see it display intelligence by asking to die, and also express love, asking the crew to care for its children, an emotion that is decidedly outside of thinking of violence, which contradicts what Mbenga said earlier.
The Jakara's children, on her homeworld, they haven't been altered. She's worried for them.
Understood. Tell her we'll make sure that they stay that way.
So even within this oversimplification within the episode, we're seeing contradictions that make this a much messier story than the episode ever wants to reckon with. There very well might have been a way to make this story work, but it would have required time, care, and a willingness to actually wrestle with the ethics of what's going on here. Instead, the episode flattens everything into a quick mercy-killing beat. And even worse, during the Juntara's death sequence, we cut straight to Pike, who compares the Juntara to a wounded animal that needs to be put down.
Yeah, when I was 14, I had a Bronco that fought so hard, she fell, broke a rib, straight into her lung, and she couldn't breathe. I didn't like what I had to do, but I did it.
That's the job sometimes.
Absolutely, what the fuck? That's where this echoes ableist rhetoric that has long been used to declare disabled lives as lesser, as burdens, as better off gone for their own needs and for ourselves. And again, I know I've said this numerous times, but I want to reiterate it. I am not saying the writers woke up one morning and thought, yes, let's sneak in some ableism today. But intent doesn't erase impact. by putting this framing in the mouths of Starfleet's heroes and treating it within the text of the episode as something noble, merciful, even aspirational. The script carelessly reproduces that logic anyways. That would be bad in and of itself, but worse, this episode doesn't air in a vacuum. Less than a month before What is Starfleet dropped, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that would push to forcibly commit unhoused people labeled mentally ill into psychiatric institutions, facilities in the US that often function more like prisons than care centers, and are often underfunded and overcrowded. Layer onto that the fact that marginalized groups are already disproportionately likely to experience homelessness and mental illness, plus the current wave of rhetoric branding trans people as mentally ill, and the pattern becomes very obvious. The language of mental illness is being weaponized as a pretext for surveillance, incarceration, and erasure of disabled, unhoused, queer, and trans people, amongst others. Anyone deemed unproductive to society. And it is quite literally about productivity. How can you contribute to society? We can also see this language echoed in RFK Jr.'s language as well. Push anti-autistic notions.
And these are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never go out on a date.
And as I was editing this, Trump signed yet another executive order directing prosecutors in Washington, D.C., the very city he has basically put under military siege in order to arrest people, including the homeless, to seek the death penalty in every eligible case, despite the city having abolished capital punishment more than 40 years ago, clearing the way for literal state-sanctioned murder of the homeless, who are also more likely to be charged with violent crimes. This, as they say, is Nazi shit.
You take the resources that we're going to give you, or you decide that you're going to be locked up in jail. That's the way it has to be now.
Or involuntary lethal injection or something. Just kill them.
All of this echoes the same logic the Nazis literally used in the 1930s and 40s to justify the mass incarceration and eventual extermination of disabled, mentally ill, queer, and trans people, even those considered racially pure, because they were seen as inherently broken and bad stock. So even in the best of times, this kind of careless storytelling is dangerous because it normalizes a framework historically weaponized against marginalized people. But right now, today, when fascist rhetoric is resurgent and politicians are openly advancing policies built on that logic, it's harmful. But we gotta keep going on this episode because even worse, we also get a speedrun version in what has become a repeatedly common trope in Hollywood. Yes, you're fighting for survival against a genocidal force, but you're doing it wrong. We've seen it crop up in Marvel movies and TV shows.
I'm not your enemy. I agree with your fight. I just can't get with the way you're fighting it.
And even recently in Doctor Who.
You really should stop, babes.
Or what?
Or you'll regret it. Because I have met so many versions of you, kid, and revenge is just an excuse. Because your cold, filthy heart just likes to kill.
Captain Pike here echoes this sentiment when he shames the Luntari for using the Juntara at all.
What are you doing with the Jukaru? Where are you leading it?
Honoring her final wish.
No. We spent years on this project. You can't just...
Project? This is an intelligent, emotional creature. She has a right to her free will. You took that from her.
To be very clear, I am not saying the Luntari were correct in trying to turn the Juntara into a weapon at all. But by presenting this as the only way the Luntari are fighting back against the Kansar replicates the same condescension that is often used to delegitimize violent resistance against violent oppression. The idea that the oppressed are morally failing at resisting the right way. And once you frame resistance itself as immoral, you can condemn the oppressed, wash your hands of their suffering, and move on, without ever having to confront the actual violence that forced them into those choices in the first place. It's very clearly something that we've been seeing very publicly happening with Palestinians. How people will continually, to this day, frame the argument around, do you condemn Hamas, rather than talking about how Israel is genociding Palestinians. But that's not the real issue here. It is Israel literally genociding Palestinians that should be the focus. But on top of all of that, given the political framing of the rest of the episode, the idea that the Juntara is so traumatized and thus violent it's like an animal that needs to be put down also falls into another dangerous trope, portraying oppressed groups as so consumed by suffering or rage that their elimination becomes the humane solution. This is the rhetoric of the so-called cycle of violence, that oppressed people are doomed to perpetuate conflict, reduced to something animalistic or subhuman, so that the only way to end their suffering is to end them. That framing is chillingly familiar in the present, where Palestinians are routinely depicted in Western media as inherently violent. Often this is done through biological essentialism or racism, saying all Arabs are just like that. You see that rhetoric echoed in how people will say, oh, all Muslims are inherently violent, or Islam is an inherently violent religion. But it can also be done by saying that they're defined only by their trauma from conflict with Israel, so their deaths can be framed as tragic but necessary. All of this leans into the concept of ungrievability again, the idea that their lives are already inherently lost, not worth mourning too deeply, because supposedly it's more merciful for them to die, because they're never going to be able to recover from their trauma. It's just reframing violence as prevention. It's the same logic that gets dressed up in lines like, well, we had to kill them because one day they might grow up to join Hamas, or Al-Qaeda, or Hezbollah, or ISIS. Because heaven forbid we admit that people resist because they're being actively crushed. The absolutely wonderful YouTuber Jack Saint recently broke this down in his video on Zionism and The Last of Us Part 2 that I heavily encourage you to go watch. But to just briefly summarize this one point in his larger video, he pointed out how the Seraphites, or Scars, within The Last of Us Part 2 are framed as monstrous zealots. But the game itself also hints that their religion was once good, quote unquote, and the Scars were peaceful tree-hugging egalitarians before their war and trauma at the hands of the WLF corrupted them. The implication becomes that if only they had stayed docile pacifists, the WLF wouldn't be forced to continue to wage war with them. It's the good Arab versus bad Arab logic of Zionist propaganda, where resistance can be used to justify that the oppressed have been turned into monsters, even if they weren't that before. But despite its many, many problems, The Last of Us Part 2, at the very least, gives us enough world building to recognize and critique these dynamics within its text. Strange New Worlds, though, does the complete opposite. It withholds all of the context around its conflict, tossing out vague gestures towards invasion and colonial influence between the Khazar and Lutani, while also carefully maintaining plausible deniability about Starfleet's role within that conflict. This all just results in hollow storytelling that reproduces the rhetoric of dehumanization, but ducks accountability for it, parroting some of the most dangerous tropes in geopolitical fiction, all while pretending this is just harmless space pew-pew. Oh, which reminds me. Oh yeah, that's right, I'm a trans. I'm not supposed to have a gun. Oh well. Gotta go kill some Borg. But at the end of the day, there are so many unanswered questions here. I mean, why did Starfleet suddenly sign off on Pike blowing up the Juntara after explicitly ordering him to traffic it like it was a war crime DoorDash? Did the Admiralty suddenly grow a conscience? Was it just, bad vibes, forget it. We don't need to help them anymore, at least not this way. Who the hell knows? Pike even promises Starfleet will help the Luntari another way.
The Federation will continue to provide help in other ways, just not like this.
But the episode never tells us if that's literally true, or if it's just empty bureaucratic jargon, or if Pike is literally just winging it at that moment. And then the Luntari suddenly vanish from the story entirely. There's no follow-up, nothing. We're done with them. Cool, genocide subplot resolved. Roll credits, everybody! And all of this vagueness feels very deliberate, but it's hard to pin down exactly why. I think the initial assumption we're meant to make is that this vagueness is meant to be diegetic, that Beto, as the documentarian, is withholding context from us deliberately to force his framing of Starfleet, which, given how the episode wraps up for Beto's arc, is plausible, which we'll get to in just a few more seconds, but if you actually look closely, doesn't really hold up, because we see him literally pressing characters like Uhura for explicit answers within the episode that they are withholding from him.
What I don't get is how Starfleet can agree to bring a weapon of war to a distant planet. Help me understand that.
Are you recording this?
I am, yes, that's my job, just like your job. You're delivering a weapon or taking it, or maybe both. You're all just following orders. None of you like it, so I just want to know why, because it feels like the actions of a colonizer who takes.
He's literally thrown off the bridge at one point. So from what we literally textually see, it's pretty fair to conclude that Beto himself does not have any of this context, or had it withheld from him for most of the episode. However, there are also more metatextual possibilities here. One option is the Strange New World writers sanded down the details to avoid any possibility of anyone reading the episode as an allegory for current modern-day conflicts like Russia's invasion of Ukraine or Israel's genocidal campaign in Palestine being done under the pretext of war with Hamas. Or it could have also been the studio, Paramount, cutting the episode down to scrub out anything uncomfortable, which is also plausible given that this episode is only 40 minutes long, which is the shortest Strange New episode by far. But regardless of if it was the writers being too afraid to say anything directly about the world today, or the studio mandating it in order to avoid quoting any controversy, it makes not only for bland art that is afraid to say anything, but is frankly cowardly. And to be absolutely clear here, Star Trek doesn't need to make one-to-one allegories in order to resonate. One of sci-fi's strengths as a genre is its ability to reframe issues outside of our immediate politics so we can see their dynamics more clearly. This is something that recently happened with Star Wars Andor, which talked about topics of genocide, fascism, and empire, and even writer Tony Gilroy explicitly stated that he wasn't directly intending to allegorize something like what's going on in Palestine, but is very okay with people making that explicit connection.
The word genocide was not put in Andor with direct reference to Israel, but does it bother me that people make the parallel between the conflict in Gaza and Gorman? And if it rings in their ears, let it ring in their ears. I'm into it at this point.
But we don't even get that here with Strange New Worlds. At the very least, if they had tried to do an allegory for Ukraine or Palestine directly, it would have been saying something. Instead, the episode feels terrified to say anything at all. Strange New Worlds, by contrast, keeps nudging us to wonder if Starfleet is complicit in colonization, but never gives us enough to actually judge that question. Instead, the episode caps everything off with a feel-good ending that flattens morality into a smiling montage of a found family dinner between our Starfleet heroes, declaring that the difference between a federation and an empire is simply the people.
What separates a federation from an empire? And a starship from a warship?
What is Starfleet? It's the people. All of us. We make Starfleet what it is, not the other way around.
Which, you'll note, is not actually an answer to the documentary's question. Political systems don't get absolved of potential colonial violence just because a few good people work inside of them. If a system only avoids committing atrocities because individuals within it bend or ignore the orders of the system itself is still a problem. Or at the very least, you need to address the people making these problematic orders in the first place. Star Trek has repeatedly hammered this home over the years. It's done the "it's just a few bad apples" storyline a ton of times. There's a reason the term Badmiral is a fandom favorite trope. I mean, you literally can't throw a tribble without hitting an admiral halfway through a war crime in Star Trek. But Strange New Worlds doesn't even do the "it's a few bad apples" storyline. It just pats itself on the back, saying, no, Starfleet's all fine because good people are in it, and don't worry about what Starfleet ordered us to do. We did the right thing in the end. Yay! And this pat ending ultimately mirrors how so many Americans process geopolitics. It's just stuff happening over there, I don't really need to worry about it too much, while America itself is seemingly framed as inherently noble. Don't think too hard about it. It's literally Starfleet acting as Team America World Police.
America, fuck yeah!
Or, to make a more apt comparison, it's quite literally straight up Starship Troopers.
Young people from all over the globe are joining up to fight for the future.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part, too.
They're doing their part. Are you? Join the mobile infantry and save the world. Service guarantees citizenship.
That's the logic that infantilizes critique, and it's exactly what this episode ultimately does. Because Uhura literally scolds Beto for being biased against Starfleet because his sister almost died in the service. And Beto just nods along like, yep, you got me. I guess I really was being biased in making this documentary and thinking Starfleet was a colonizer.
I do think it's brave that you ask all these questions. No one should accept anything blindly.
And that's all I was trying to do. I was just trying to provide a counterpoint.
I believe you think that's what you were trying to do, but you came here angry. You had a point to prove.
Then the whole thing pivots into a cheery montage, which is supposedly edited by Beto himself, about how wonderful Starfleet is, which neatly avoids the actual questions he started out asking. And so the takeaway ultimately becomes then that the desire to critique Starfleet or any institution as a colonizer comes only because you've got an axe to grind and you need to get over yourself. And to be very clear, going back to our earlier point, Beto is a lousy documentarian. He is clearly interested throughout the entire episode in proving his pre-baked thesis than actually investigating it, trying to force his framing with the very leading questions that he asked the crew throughout the episode.
I think what makes me good at my job is that I have a lot of experience. From a younger age, I've had to look after myself, and I've learned to make logical decisions very quickly in tense, high-risk situations.
What does it feel like to kill somebody?
But even moving beyond his bias, though, we clearly see that he stumbled onto some legitimate criticisms. Starfleet did literally order the Enterprise to traffic a living weapon for a side in a war, and the crew just salutes and complies until an accident forces them to notice that it's, a sentient tortured being who might also be used for war crimes. And the Federation only backs off from this at the last second for reasons that are never explained. There's a real critique somewhere in here if the episode cared to engage with it and actually get specific. Instead, it frames any challenge to power as unfair, biased, and overly emotional, because the people inside the system mean well. We're asked explicitly to ignore and forget how close Starfleet came to committing a war crime, and instead accept the liberal-brained logic of, sure, Starfleet and America may seemingly act like empire sometimes, but they mean well, so it's fine. The real problem is those pesky leftists who are being too critical. The subtext is that youthful political activism, especially from kids, is inherently naive, self-serving, or utopian. The grown-ups in the room know better. We really know how complicated this all really is, so just sit back down. And again, given the context of this episode's release, that's an incredibly fucked up message. It mirrors the same logic used to dismiss students protesting the genocide in Palestine, like those at Columbia University, framing them as childish outbursts from kids who don't understand the complexities of geopolitics, who simply have a youthful, rebellious axe to grind against America and Israel, rather than people with a very clear and concise demand that America, or the institutions they are protesting like Columbia University, by giving money, weapons, and political backing to Israel's ongoing genocide machine. But instead of engaging with many of these youthful activist critiques, commenters hand-wave... That feels like, a metaphor. But instead of engaging with these activist critiques, commenters hand-wave it away as too messy, too loud, or too unsophisticated. Take, for example, Columbia professor John McWhorter, who wrote that protests by Columbia students against their university and America's complicity with Israel were...
daily, loud, louder, into the night, and using ever angrier rhetoric, beyond what any people should be expected to bear up under.
He openly admits that the war on Gaza is horrific, but shrugs that off because the
issues are complex. Legitimate questions remain about the definition of genocide, about a nation's right to defend itself. There is a reason many consider the Israeli-Palestinian conflict the most morally challenging in the modern world. Oh, God, I'm gonna be sick. Okay. What questions about the definition of genocide does this speaker think there are? Because I did a whole video where I had to look up the exact definition of genocide, and it's actually pretty clear-cut. It's actually quite comprehensive in a lot of ways, especially if you keep in mind the definition of genocide is to do any of the 5 things listed, as opposed to doing all of them. Like, the only thing that I really take issue with the definition of genocide is they need to broaden how many categories it could apply to. So yeah, if you're gonna use that rant, which you don't have to, by any means. Like, I don't know, I'm too pissed off.
In other words, it comes across as, get off my lawn, university kids, it's complicated. But the morality here isn't complicated. The geopolitics very well might be, yes, but the genocide is not. But this framing leads to pro-Palestinian activists being actively vilified and dehumanized, enabling them to be branded as anti-Semitic or unpatriotic or even dangerous for criticizing American or Israeli institutions complicit in genocide by both parties in the United States, as well as Israel's political parties as well.
We're here to discuss the little Gazas that have risen up on campuses across America and the liberal college administrators and politicians who refuse to restore law and order and to protect other students. These little Gazas are disgusting cesspools of anti-Semitic hate, full of pro-Hamas sympathizers, fanatics, and freaks.
And less than a year after the Columbia University protests, the Trump administration has weaponized this dehumanization to justify these same protesters and pro-Palestinian activists being surveilled, jailed, and deported, as well as to use the vilification of all protests to justify further military crackdown on protests across the country, even in my own home city of Los Angeles. What is Starfleet echoes that exact logic. Critiques of a government or its allies must come from prejudicial bias or naivety, not legitimacy. Conformity to Starfleet is framed as a moral goodness in and of itself, as if these future humans are just so inherently virtuous that every officer just naturally does the right thing, no matter what the institution will say. The show isn't asking us to think critically, it's asking us to be pom-pom waving cheerleaders for Starfleet. The distinctions on why the institution chose to do what it did matters, but the show won't touch them. Instead, it just assumes the best. Of course Starfleet cared, of course they mean well, because Starfleet is always good. Strange New Worlds then leaves us in a hollow moral universe that is justified entirely by its own self-mythology. Starfleet is good because this is the utopian future franchise, so stop worrying and clap. We know that this is the better future for everyone, so don't worry about looking into the details of anything that how it runs at all, or use this franchise to actually say something about those institutions. But the best Star Trek never shied away from the complicated tensions that define American values and its actual actions. It actively wrestled with it. Star Trek has always used Starfleet and the Federation as both a mirror of America in the present-day context of when those series were written, as well as a projection of what America could be. The original series did this constantly. In the episode Errand of Mercy, Kirk contrasts overtly the Federation's democracy with the Klingon Empire's expansionism, but the story makes it very clear that both are acting as colonial powers trying to influence a society, mirroring how in the then contemporaneous Cold War conflict, the US and USSR were each carving out spheres of influence while the US still framed itself as the good guys.
You of the Federation, you are much like us. We're nothing like you. We're a democratic body.
Come now, Captain. I'm not referring to minor ideological differences. I mean that we are similar as a species. Here we are on a planet of sheep. 2 tigers. Predators. Hunters. Killers. And it is precisely that which makes us great.
The episode of Private Little War is even more on the nose about this. Like What is Starfleet, it's an episode about Starfleet providing military aid and the complications that rise because of it, but here we see Kirk arming a revolutionary group on an unindustrialized planet in order to counter Klingons' intervention with that government on the planet. The episode is far from perfect. Good God, some of that makeup is real racist. But the episode directly parallels the Federation's actions on this planet with America's actions in Vietnam and Korea.
Do you remember the 20th century brush wars on the Asian continent? 2 giant powers involved, much like the Klingons and ourselves. Neither side felt that they could pull out.
Yes, I remember. It went on bloody year after bloody year.
And the episode ends in genuine ambiguity, forcing the audience to sit with whether escalating a conflict, one that will claim countless lives and reshape an indigenous population's culture that had nothing to do with the Federation or the Klingons before this, can ever be justified, and force the audience to think about how America was just as culpable as the USSR in this dynamic, even as it tried to justify its actions under the banner of fighting the dirty commies. In the 1990s, Star Trek The Next Generation, coming on the heels of the Reagan-era's renewed American exceptionalism, was generally much more optimistic about Starfleet as an institution, but it also still questioned Starfleet's motives from time to time. Picard openly resisted orders that he found unjust, like the forced relocation of indigenous people in the episode Journey's End, even if he ultimately did carry out those orders.
You see, Admiral, there are some very disturbing historical parallels here. Once more, they're being asked to leave their homes because of a political decision that has been taken by a distant government.
An Indian representative was included in the deliberations at the Federation Council. His objections were noted, discussed, but ultimately rejected.
We also had characters like Wesley Crusher even explicitly going further, resigning his commission in protest of these orders.
I know Admiral Nechayev gave you an order, and she was given an order from the Federation Council. But it's still wrong.
That decision is not yours to make, Cadet. I don't know what has got into you lately. And frankly, right now, I don't care. But I will tell you this. While you wear that uniform, you will obey every order you are given. And you will conform to Starfleet regulations and rules of conduct. Is that clear?
Yes, sir, it is. But I won't be wearing this uniform any longer.
Hell, there's literally an entire movie, Star Trek Insurrection, where Picard goes rogue in order to stop a Starfleet admiral from exploiting an indigenous population's resources at the cost of that population's health, all for the Federation's gain. You know, like an Imperial power would do. Again, it's treated as a one bad apple, but it's still showing that the Federation can act as an Imperial power. Deep Space Nine itself took a more openly cynical approach to institutions in response to TNG's exceptionalism, often portraying Starfleet itself as capable of institutional prejudice, nationalism to the point of extremism.
We're Red Squad, and we can do anything. Red Squad, Red Squad, Red Squad, Red Squad, Red Squad, Red Squad, Red Squad.
And even willing to enact military or state violence, sometimes against its own citizens, in order to ensure its survival. And within those episodes, the show affirmed the idea that individuals inside the system could still fight for its ideals, like what is Starfleet wants to do, while still pointing out that the institution has problems, which what is Starfleet avoids doing. Julian Bashir, for example, faces discrimination as an augment within Starfleet, yet also continually pushes back against its darkest corners, such as the CIA-like Section 31, actively, openly calling for the institution to uphold the values that it claims to believe in.
I don't like it, but I've spent the last year and a half of my life ordering young men and young women to die. I like that even less.
That's a glib answer, and a cheap way to avoid the fact that you've trampled on the very thing that those young men and women are out there dying to protect. Does that not mean anything to you?
And like the original series, Deep Space Nine was never afraid to end in ambiguity in favor of simplified morality, like Strange New Worlds is doing.
So is that what we have become? A 24th century Rome, driven by nothing other than the certainty that Caesar can do no wrong!
In episodes like In the Pale Moonlight, we are forced to watch the show's hero, Sisko, become complicit in state-sanctioned lies and murder in order to manipulate a foreign power, the Romulans, into joining a war as Federation allies, because Sisko believes the Federation is worth saving even at the cost of Romulan lives. And that episode doesn't end on a, well, rah, 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 Starfleet is good, so it's fine message, but it lets us wrestle with whether or not Sisko was justified.
A guilty conscience is a small price to pay for the safety of the Alpha Quadrant. So I will learn to live with it. Because I can live with it.
Even Star Trek Discovery, arriving as it did in the wake of Donald Trump's first term and post-Reagan neoliberal America's first real crisis of faith in the inherent goodness of American institutions, had Michael Burnham challenge the Federation's consideration of a genocidal strike on the Klingon home planet of Kronos.
Is this how Starfleet wins the war? Genocide.
Terms of atrocity are convenient after the fact. The Klingons are on the verge of wiping out the Federation. We do not have the luxury of principle.
That is all we have, Admiral.
Yes, that episode leaned on the somewhat simplified appeal to the better angels of the institution rhetoric straight out of the Do Better, Senator playbook, but it kind of still worked there because the Federation is still at least framed as an aspirational institution. Fallible, yet open to critique and capable of change in a way that modern-day America may not be, but which the show is wishing America, in a post-Trump world, could do.
A year ago, I stood alone. I believed that our survival was more important than our principles. I was wrong. Do we need a mutiny today? To prove who we are.
It's very naive of Star Trek Discovery, but it was at least trying to point out that institutions can do bad things. And to be very clear, I don't want to say that every single story has to paint Starfleet as corrupt or problematic. Sometimes it's enough to show it as a functioning system, an aspirational system even. But if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that the story is relevant to the context in which it's releasing in. Lower Decks did this beautifully in its Season 3 premiere. Captain Freeman is arrested for allegedly blowing up the Pac-led planet, and her daughter Mariner doesn't trust Starfleet to give her a fair trial, and so she goes rogue in order to prove her mom's innocence.
Everyone's acting like the trial's already over when there is no way that Mom did anything wrong.
Look, you and I both know that, and plenty of people in the courtroom know it too. You just need to be patient and trust in the system.
Oh, you mean the same system that's now putting her on trial? Oh yeah, I freaking love the system.
But in the end of the episode, we learn that Starfleet actually investigated and exonerated Freeman, that the system actually worked for her.
So it was a classic Pac-led Samaritan snare, writ large, and it would have worked if not for Starfleet's best believing in one of their own.
Holy sh**.
Oh, can we hear that again, please?
Wow. Starfleet really came through. Who'd have thought?
Me, Beckett. I told you from the start to trust in the system. I said it this morning.
And that story works because it acknowledges our present-day skepticism, where many of us today wouldn't trust something like an American institution to do right by a black woman, even a black woman military leader, given how deeply anti-blackness and sexism is baked into many of America's institutions. Hell, just this year, Donald Trump literally fired Joint Chief of Staff Chair C.Q. Brown Jr., a man who has a long and proven military record, by dismissing him as nothing more than a DEI hire. And that man did nothing wrong, at least by the standards of American institutions. He was still part of, the American war machine. So Mariner's distrust of Starfleet as a system mirrors our modern-day reality. But, especially within Lower Decks, Starfleet is supposed to represent a future where we've moved beyond institutional anti-blackness, at least for humans. We still have institutional prejudices elsewhere against synths and augments and others. It makes Starfleet aspirational, reflecting a world that is better than our current day. The episode questions the institutions and acknowledges what we, the modern audience, would be feeling while still affirming the ideal of Starfleet as a better institution. All this goes to show that every single Star Trek series was written within a context. The original series is born out of the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement. The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine wrestled with 1990s American exceptionalism and cynicism. Hell, even Star Trek Enterprise tried to process post-9/11 neoconservatism and the invasion of Afghanistan. Badly, I might add, but it did at least try. Star Trek Discovery's first season was a mirror for the rise of Trump-era nationalism and fascism refracted through the Klingon Empire and the literal fascist mirror universe. Hell, even Star Trek Picard managed to do an overt ice bad storyline inside a catastrophically structured season of television, sure, but still, it said ice bad. That's a message I can vibe with right now.
You eyeballing me, asshole. What the hell is wrong with you guys? Slap on a badge, put on a uniform, you think you can treat people this way?
Trek has always been of its time, and that is why it resonates. Great science fiction and great art can endure and speak to new audiences over time, over decades and centuries even, yes. But it's often because it is rooted in the moment of its creation, in the world it was born from. For all of its many problems, Trek was always at least willing to wrestle with the issues of its time through the prism of an imagined, more inclusive multicultural future. It engaged with the world around it, and thus, even when it failed in talking about these issues, it allowed there to be a conversation. As the late great Ursula K. Le Guin wrote,
"Science fiction is not predictive, it is descriptive. Predictions are uttered by prophets, free of charge, by clairvoyants, who usually charge a fee and are therefore more honored in their day than prophets, and by futurologists, salaried. Prediction is the business of prophets, clairvoyants, and futurologists. It is not the business of novelists. A novelist's business is lying. All fiction is metaphor. Science fiction is metaphor. What sets it apart from older forms of fiction seems to be its use of new metaphors, drawn from certain great domains of our contemporary life. Science, all the sciences, and technology, and the relativistic and the historical outlook among them. Space travel is one of these metaphors. So is an alternative society, an alternative biology. The future is another. The future in fiction is a metaphor.
God, I fucking love that woman so goddamn much. All of you out there need to read more fucking Ursula K. Le Guin. Just please do. But when you try to strip away context from a work of art, all that's left is a hollow, timeless image. It becomes self-referential symbols that have no meaning unto themselves and thus simply a product to buy and sell, endlessly regurgitated until all that's left is the empty glow of familiarity. Strange New Worlds itself wants to run away from its context, to be nice and easy nostalgia. And it makes one wonder if a franchise like Star Trek can really escape the gravity well of late-stage capitalist hollowing out. Even Strange New Worlds writers, like its own executive producer Bill Wolkoff, who's not just progressive, but an actual overt union activist who was even a captain during the 2023 WGA strike, and someone who I've literally interviewed on my channel about unions and fighting AI in the writer's room, are hemmed in by the structures that they work under. I mean, let me ask you this question. Despite literally having an executive producer who is an overt union man helping run the show, do you think that Strange New Worlds today could put out something like Deep Space Nine's Bar Association episode, which was literally about unions' rights and straight up quoted Karl Marx?
Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
What's happened to you?
The answer that I have to give is, I doubt it. And to be very clear, I do place a lot of the blame for this season of Strange New Worlds on the studio, as well as the general executive direction of Star Trek that's coming from both Paramount and Secret Hideout. But I also do think the writers of Strange New Worlds themselves specifically also deserve criticism. And I want to be very clear, I don't say this to attack any of them. Any of you go after any of these writers, I will come after you. My critique here isn't about going after anyone, but about holding Trek, as well as many of these writers, to the standards that they set for themselves. That they should be bold, writing challenging storytelling that pushes beyond the safe and familiar. After the episode 4.5 Vulcans aired, many Trekkies called out its racialized and eugenics logic, like my close friend Giraffe, who's also biracial like Spock.
Because I've been pretty vocal before about how poorly biracial identity has been portrayed in Star Trek. So I want to be clear about why this one, in particular, hurt so deeply. As a biracial person, I found this episode incredibly painful to watch. It wasn't just disappointing, it felt harmful. The title, 4.5 Vulcan, hit me pretty hard, honestly. Framing somebody's worth and identity in fractions like that is something biracial people know all too well. It reduces us to pieces of ourselves instead of a whole person, and it reinforces the idea that we'll never fully belong anywhere. That kind of language is not funny. It's damaging.
And in regards to critiques like hers, Bill Wolkoff posted,
regarding criticisms of Strange New Worlds, I'd like to say personally, as just one writer, I'm always listening, always learning, sending my undying appreciation to the entire Trek fandom, all of you, and mutual undying esteem for the Vulcan philosophy of infinite diversity in infinite combinations.
To be very transparent before we go further, I want to just say I do know Bill a little bit. We're not like close besties or anything, but I've interviewed him on this channel, and he's personally actively been supportive of me personally in some of my own professional filmmaking endeavors. So I am biased when I say this, but I do know that his intention is genuine, and he is trying to be kind in that statement, and I do think he has an earnest desire to try to listen and to learn. But it also underscores the problem that these concerns clearly weren't raised in the writer's room where they could have easily been caught, and it speaks to whose voices aren't in the room when these stories are being made. Why wasn't it a practice to have these scripts looked over for these issues before, when Star Trek shows like Lower Decks, Prodigy, and Discovery seemed to be trending in a positive direction in that regard before Strange New Worlds? Why now have we regressed? It speaks to the leadership on Strange New Worlds, and it also speaks to the general cultural environment that we're in. And one wonders, ultimately, if Strange New Worlds or other future Star Trek projects will be allowed to put the learning that some of these writers want to do into practice when Hollywood, as an industry, keeps lashing out at the very perspectives that could help it evolve and survive. One wonders if those voices will continue to have a chance to enter into Star Trek in a meaningful way, as they were starting to do, and should have been doing many decades earlier. And it's worth mentioning that as I was editing this video, Strange New Worlds producers Henry Alonzo Myers and Akiva Goldsman gave an interview where they blamed Season 3's unevenness on staffing changes and the writer's strike. And sure, I get that writer strikes and turnover probably did lead to rushed scripts. That certainly didn't help this season. But that doesn't really fully explain the show's fixation on member-berry storylines or excuse episodes that lean on racist logic to tell a story. Comparatively, Star Trek The Next Generation's second season also launched during a writer strike. That season was certainly also uneven, yes, and it even had its own disastrous missteps from time to time, like when it used an unproduced Star Trek Phase 2 script from the 70s that was offensive in its treatment of women's bodily autonomy. But even still, that season gave us some of Trek's finest hours, like Measure of a Man or Q Who, both episodes that pushed the franchise forward instead of coasting on nostalgia of problematic tropes.
Starfleet was founded to seek out new life. Well, there it sits. Waiting.
The animated series and even 2009's Star Trek film were both shaped by strike conditions as well. And those projects had flaws, most certainly, but they also have plenty of charm and real positives. So no, the strikes didn't create Season 3's issues. They exposed and made worse a deeper problem that had already been building. And with Season 4 written before Season 3 even aired, I'm not sure how much of that will have been addressed. Still, Star Trek has a history of surprising us, and I would love nothing more than to see Season 4 rise to the challenge. It speaks to the much more problematic trend that we can see in the broader shift in Star Trek's messaging lately. Take Very Short Treks, the animated YouTube short series made to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the animated series, which were written by comedian Casper Kelly. Those shorts mostly leaned on boomer-style reaction humor. Aliens are gross, aliens are weird, and ugh, people are too angry and ready to cancel me for saying the wrong things.
We have bigger fish to fry.
What? You want to fry me?
Ensign, please, don't get your knickers in a twist!
How dare you!
What?
We Nickersonians are a proud species who serve the Federation with honor. You'll forgive me if I decline to be in a twist.
I am so sorry!
I should report this to HR.
The Section 31 movie was another example, and I've already talked endlessly about that. Similarly, Picard's Season 3 dove headfirst into the nostalgia well and came out with a story where the Federation committed war crimes. Picard told a victim of those crimes that she was too traumatized to live and needed to be put down, and the final villain was literally a Borg youth mind virus defeated by the crew of geriatrics reliving their 1990s glory days. These are deeply conservative story structures, and I think it's in large part from a generation of writers who see Star Trek as something that they loved in the past and want to recreate, rather than something they want to add more context to and create meaningful stories within. All done so that it can become a safe, timeless product and rarely has to wrestle with the perspective of marginalized people trying to enter into Star Trek who loved it, but also had to wrestle with its fascinating inconsistencies and how it treated people like us. And this is ultimately the biggest point that I want to make, because this hollowing out of Star Trek, and art generally speaking as we're seeing in our current age, allows it to be co-opted for much darker ends. Because it's the same rhetorical move in how the right likes to frame art. Take out places like PragerU or the Daily Wire use William Shakespeare as a symbol of timeless Western greatness in art.
And the reason it's the great play is it's written at the moment when the modern world appears. One of the shocking things about Hamlet is the minute you hear his voice, you think, ah, that's us. And it's suddenly out of history, our voice appears. And Shakespeare anticipates every single philosophical and emotional problem that is going to grow up out of what is the great division that causes modernity, which is the Reformation.
They often recycle writer Ben Jonson's line that Shakespeare was,
"He was not of an age, but for all time,"
while also sneering that the woke left wants to replace Shakespeare with black lesbian poets like Audre Lorde.
The English department at the University of Pennsylvania replaced the portrait of the greatest English language writer who ever lived, William Shakespeare, with a picture of a black lesbian poet. Why? Because he was a white European male. Leftist professors have replaced the pursuit of excellence with the pursuit of diversity.
The effect is to devalue other contexts, cultures, and ideas as inherently lesser, while upholding Western written literature as the be-all, end-all of what art can be.
The British wrote better than anyone. They were better at writing. Their books are better. Their language is better. Their insights are better. I've read all the Europeans. I've read a lot of people from other places. The British in the period in the 18th and 19th century wrote better than anyone had ever written before. Oh, I'm a racist.
And that it already said everything that it needed to say over 100 years ago. and that we're just recycling the same stories over and over again.
Visionaries are speaking to you from the past. It's as if people had come to you in a time machine and said, this is what it's like. And they're genius people. They're not your professors who are second-rate people. They are genius people with vision and talent that comes from God. They're being spoken to by the muses from God. This is what Shakespeare is doing. He's channeling stuff. He's not just thinking it up by himself.
Once you do that, you get myth, something supposedly timeless. And timelessness is exactly what right-wing cultural projects want. They want art removed from its historical roots turned into proof of Western superiority. And yet, when we look at something like this idea of timeless Shakespeare, we see how it erases the fact that his works emerged from and engaged with specific historical contexts. Shakespeare's plays, for example, reproduced anti-Semitism and racism that were rampant at the time that they were created. But also, they wrestled with those ideas and even questioned institutions like Christianity, which was also a pervading institution of the time. Shakespeare's works are multifaceted, flawed, and brilliant all at the same time. That's what makes them so interesting. And they only gain meaning when we grapple with them in context, while also talking about what they say on their own terms as well. To strip all that away is to flatten art into dogma. Dead Domain recently made a brilliant video about this. I would recommend go checking it out, where they showed how the right wing weaponizes nostalgia for a past that never existed, manufactured by capitalist advertising. The 1920s America, invoked by slogans like "Make America Great Again" or by right-wing propagandists, were never real. It was an advertising fantasy. White picket fence suburbia, smiling housewives, wholesome family drivers. It was a sanitized image of white middle-class life sold as the American experience. And that false memory is now being weaponized politically. And because it never actually existed, it can never actually be restored, only endlessly invoked to justify excluding those who never fit the myth to begin with. Immigrants, queer people, black Americans, indigenous folks, the disabled, the poor, and numerous others. But what makes Star Trek so particularly interesting is that when it's reduced to pure myth, it actually trades on a slightly different kind of nostalgia. Not a return to an idyllic past necessarily, but a city on the hill future that supposedly arrives if we just stay the course. Instead of futures we must fight for, Star Trek as a myth sells a utopia that never was and never could be because it refuses to engage with the fact that Star Trek was always reflecting the issues of the modern day. And as a result, we get Strange New Worlds, which carries forward the ingrained cultural norms of biological essentialism, disability, gender, militarism, status quo worship, heteronormativity, and all those ideas can be used to reinforce the idea that we need to make a future that looks remarkably like the present. And anyone who fights against the current status quo of the present day is the problem. It's ultimately why I find it naive when people say that Star Trek can never be co-opted for right-wing or conservative ends. This is something that the wonderful actor Robert Picardo, who stars in Star Trek Voyager and will star in the upcoming Starfleet Academy, recently did, when he insisted that Starfleet couldn't be co-opted for apolitics because, as he put it, diversity is just baked into Star Trek and its ideals are immutable. History shows otherwise. It's why tech oligarchs like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Sam Altman love to sell a Star Trek-style utopian future that we can achieve through technological determinism that they can benefit from and profit off of. It's why they easily use Star Trek for that style of propaganda.
It's like Starfleet Academy. We want to make Starfleet Academy real.
Skydance itself is run by David Ellison, son of Larry Ellison, the man who is now the richest man in the world ahead of Elon Musk. Larry is the CEO of Oracle and a man who stands to benefit from many of Donald Trump's tech policies. Skydance itself, as part of the merger with Paramount, pledged newsrooms reforms at CBS News, including an ombudsman to police bias against the Trump administration, as well as a promise to, as I've mentioned before, drop DEI programs. And now there have been reports that Skydance is going to acquire Barry Weiss's The Free Press, with CEO David Ellison openly floating the idea of giving Weiss editorial influence at CBS News. The Free Press itself has made its brand on an anti-Trump posture, insisting it's independent while consistently framing the left as a bigger danger than MAGA authoritarianism, as well as running Gaza coverage that does things that try to undercut images of famine as propaganda. It's centrism weaponized, a veneer of neutrality that drags the center rightward. And it's the same exact posture Strange New World is reproducing, pretending to float above politics while quietly affirming the status quo. All of this is why I'm making a follow-up video to this one on why tech oligarchs love Star Trek. And it's already up on my Patreon, by the way. And just being real with you for a very quick minute, YouTube views have been going down hard lately, as many of you have probably been seeing from your other favorite YouTubers, which means ad revenue has been shrinking at the same time. Just to be very clear, the financial pressure has been getting a little bit rougher, and Erin, my fiance, and I are trying to do things like leave the US hopefully within the next year or so, because it's becoming increasingly unsafe for us to be here as trans people. So supporting me on Patreon literally is what makes it possible for me to keep doing videos like this, to also pay my rent, as well as hopefully stay safe and to try to live a life that's not fully in fear at the moment. So if you like what I do and you want to see more and want to maybe help me and my fiance and also our 4 kitties, please consider joining my Patreon and get that tech oligarch video early. Every bit of support truly matters right now. But getting back on track, all of this is why centrism, as it functions in our politics today, doesn't actually balance left and right like it argues it does, but actually primes people towards conservatism and ultimately towards fascism. It reassures us that the system basically works, that progress is inevitable, that utopia is always just around the corner as long as we simply restore the status quo. But when that paradise never arrives, it must mean that someone must be standing in the way of our inevitable progress to the Star Trek utopia. And because centrism insists on balance, it casts blame in both directions, equating marginalized people who demand reform or even radical change to systems that actively harm us with the fascists who target us, as if both of us are equally culpable for destabilizing society. That false equivalence props up the status quo and blames victims for their own suffering and leaves centrists not as neutral arbiters, but as enablers of the very violence they claim to oppose. Centrism lulls people into passivity, which ultimately enables fascism. And so while centrists wag their fingers at fascists while clinging to the same myths, America being inherently good, that colonial projects are civilizing and that we're the good guys, the system itself and the hierarchies and assumptions that produce the harm is never questioned, even as fascists openly weaponize its levers to attack the vulnerable. And this is where I'm going to get the most political in this video, so sorry for this little detour, but it is important and it's something I've been feeling, so I'm tricking you into talking about it through a Star Trek video, which, is what Star Trek should be doing. Take how I, and so many other trans people, have been treated for speaking up about someone like Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom has been steadily gaining traction as an anti-Trump figure, dunking on Republicans and Trump with memes, sparring with them online, and even copying their tactics politically, like redistricting California in response to Texas doing the same. There's already talk of him as being the presumptive Democrat nominee for the 2028 presidential election. Yet at the same time, Gavin Newsom has worked to block or bury trans protections in California, vetoing custody protections for affirming parents, discouraging LGBTQ bills, and parodying right-wing rhetoric on pronouns, incarcerating trans people, and gender-affirming care, all in the effort to cultivate a right wing in his potential bid for president. He's even platformed far-right figures like Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk on his podcast where they were allowed to spit their bile, normalizing their rhetoric for a progressive-style audience, especially with issues around trans people, with Newsom even vocally agreeing about discriminatory practices on trans people in sports.
Right now should come out and be like, you know what? The young man who's about to win the state championship in the long jump in female sports, that shouldn't happen. You as the governor should step out and say no.
No, and I appreciate,
but like, would you do something like that? Would you say no men in female sports?
Well, I think it's an issue of fairness. I completely agree with you on that.
I can see you wrestling with it.
No, I'm not wrestling. I'm not wrestling with the fairness issue. I totally agree with you. By the way, as someone with 4 kids, I think
and
got
2 daughters, right?
2 daughters.
And I have a daughter too.
And a wife that went, God forbid, to Stanford and played on the junior national soccer team, and a guy who got into college only because I was left-handed and could throw a baseball a little bit or hit the ball for a little bit. So I revere sports, and so the issue of fairness is completely legit.
And yet when trans people or other marginalized folks call this out, we're framed as the bad guys. Because meanwhile, he's trolling Trump with memes, going viral, and posturing as the Democrat who owns the right. The spectacle becomes the point. People would rather watch the meme war and Newsom sparring with politicians while also clearing out homeless encampments and redrawing districts and pushing down LGBTQ rights than face how those moves actually screw over the most vulnerable. It's comfort as politics. Better to have a strong man who looks tough against fascism than actually do the terrifying, difficult work of building up and dreaming something new, better, and more inclusive. And the result is that saving democracy becomes the slogan for watching it erode, all while trans people, the unhoused, and anyone already on the margins are written off as acceptable collateral. This is exactly why so-called centrism primes people to side with fascism. Fascism can dress itself up as civil because it defends the status quo, wielding institution laws and cultural norms like weapons against the marginalized. And make no mistake, whether it's enforced with a pen, a cop's badge, a soldier's gun, or ICE's deportation orders, it is political violence. We saw this overtly play out in the aftermath of the horrific murder of Charlie Kirk, something I already broke down in the whole video, when establishment news media pundits and politicians across the spectrum rushed to frame him as a respectable figure who did politics the right way. They scrubbed away his violent, dehumanizing rhetoric, while anyone, but especially queer, trans, or other marginalized people who dared to name his harm over the years were smeared as celebrating his death and punished through being fired, silenced, censored, harassed, or made targets of violence themselves. This is centrism's civility politics in action. It shields fascists as polite players in the system while branding resistance itself as dangerous. Centrism doesn't just tolerate fascism, it clears the path for it by legitimizing it and accelerating it. And this is where I can't help but think of Strange New Worlds, a show that I have usually found comfort in, but now wants to have neutrality in the face of all of this, that wants to say nothing as all of this goes down. And it reminds me that respectability isn't neutral. I'm not here to attack anyone who enjoys this season of the show. You are absolutely allowed to love what you love, and I genuinely, from my heart, mean that. If this show makes you think, or inspires you, or even just gives you a moment of comfort in a terribly cruel world, that's wonderful. But in my totally unscientific survey of Trekkies right now, i.e. asking my friends and doom-scrolling the subreddits at 2 a.m., when people tell me why they love it, it's almost always framed through nostalgia. I got chills seeing Kirk in the chair, or it was so cool when they canonized the Trelane is Q theory. Rarely is anyone talking about the show on its own terms as something that can have actual meaning. And I get it. Nostalgia isn't bad. The world is brutal right now. Everything feels overwhelming and unstable. We're scared about bills, about ICE coming to get us or our friends, about being legislated out of existence, about whether we can afford groceries or not. In moments like that, of course it's tempting to cling to something warm and familiar. I do it too. When I'm depressed, and frankly I am deeply depressed right now, I've been regularly having hard conversations with my partner and my friends about whether any of us are even happy anymore. I often retreat into Star Trek audiobooks that I grew up with. They remind me of when I was hopeful, of stories that told me that the future could be bright, that someone like me, a woman who was once seen as a boy, could belong in that future. Going back into nostalgia for a little bit reminds me of what I love, reminds me why I fight, why I still hold on to hope despite everything. But the truth is, many fans who watch Star Trek and many who engage with politics right now don't have to wrestle with the issues that a show like Strange New Worlds sidesteps. And so they can just lie in that nostalgia. And so when marginalized fans voice discomfort with the season, I've seen many a Trekkie friend group collapse because others snap back that they just want a fun Star Trek show. And then add into that, for people who cover Star Trek, the capitalistic incentives of access to episode screeners and access to actor interviews that privileges frictionless cheerleading over real critique, and voices like mine get pushed aside. And so as Strange New Worlds gets endless praise, I'm told to stop overthinking, it's not that deep, just enjoy it, and it becomes a perfect microcosm of the larger issue that I've been talking about. I myself, on my reviews where I critiqued this season, have been equated with grifters like Nerdrotic and The Critical Drinker, men who have spent years harassing people like me, as if critique in and of itself is the same as bad faith culture war outrage grifting. That, ultimately, at the end of the day, is not just anti-intellectual, it's cruel. Because this is my favorite franchise too. And right now, its reinforcing worldview is actively being used to harm me and attack me, all in the name of comfort. And I'm not here to tear anyone down. I'm here because I want more. I wrote this whole fucking video because I want more from Star Trek. I want more from this world that I am forced to live within. Because I believe that we all deserve better, not just in our stories, but in how we think about the future. That's the larger dynamic at work here, the way comfort is weaponized to protect the status quo and how marginalized voices gets painted as the problem simply for demanding more from the worlds, the people, the community that we love. We can fight for a better future by imagining it both in our art and enacting it in our politics. We can even see in things like James Gunn's Superman and Star Wars Andor that franchise storytelling inside Hollywood's nostalgia machine can still be political, inspiring, and overtly radical. And even beyond the mainstream, marginalized and independent creators have always been doing this. So much of our art especially has generally always had stories about building new worlds in defiance of the ones that try to erase us, hoping and reaching for something more. And while I personally have grown more jaded with the system, whether it be the Hollywood bear as a filmmaker and creator or my more anarchistic politics, at the same time I have grown more hopeful. Because the spaces to tell these kinds of stories are still there, both inside and outside the machine. They always have been, and if our stories are able to still be told, that means it's still up to us to make our own future, that it is still possible. We cannot get trapped in nostalgia. It's why I've always loved Star Trek so much. Star Trek has always been about asking us to learn, to stay curious, and most importantly, to see ourselves in the other, not just in the mirror. That's why it has meant so much to marginalized people like me over the years, because it said we belonged in the future too. That's why we've always loved it and why we critique it when it fails. Not to tear it down, but because we care, because we want the future that Trek imagines us to feel is possible for all of us. We don't want to destroy that vision, we want to build it together with you. But building a better future sometimes means being willing to let go of the parts that harm us, even dismantle them or get rid of them completely, so something more just can grow in its place. That's the work of Trek at its best, and it's the work of politics too, not clinging to symbols or institutions because they comfort us, but holding ourselves to the promise of something better. To say there can be more than what there is now. But that only happens if we not only acknowledge diversity, but take delight in it. If we find joy in listening to other people, to hear their concerns, to listen to their perspectives, and choose to change when harm is pointed out. That's how we insist upon a better world. That's how we make sure it is not just possible, but necessary. That's the heart of Star Trek. Star Trek was never about saying that this is the way the future will inevitably be. It's saying this is the future we can try to reach for if we acknowledge our problems today. And we might even make a world better than Star Trek could ever have envisioned.
For that one fraction of a second, you were open to options you had never considered. That is the exploration that awaits you. Not mapping stars and studying nebula, but charting the unknown possibilities of existence.
Too often, though, people keep retreating into the comfort of the idea of an inevitable future. That they can just sit back passively and hope that it will one day come. But more and more of us are realizing we were never truly comfortable. We were just told to swallow more and more pain to survive, until now it's starting to overflow, too much to ignore. Even those clinging to the past feel that same yearning, that they're trapped too, used up by a system that only exploits them. Trek's real power isn't destiny, it's imagination. And maybe that's not Star Trek's power, it's ours. The relentless push to ask what the future could be, and to carry that yearning into the fight for something better. The season finale of Strange New Worlds, Season 3, revolves around a storyline about true evil. Back in Episode 5, we're introduced to these ancient beings, the Vesta, who have been imprisoned since before time was recorded, and are now primed to break free. And in the finale, we're told that they're the source of all evil in the Star Trek universe.
I mean, what if they are the evil that predates doing evil? What if they are evil itself?
The reason so many cultures supposedly have myths about pure good and pure evil.
The idea that good and evil exist, have always existed, is the most commonly shared belief in all the galaxy.
It's silly and dumb, but Trek has always been silly and dumb sometimes. Threshold still exists after all. In fact, it's part of why I love Star Trek, that it's silly and dumb. What bothers me is what this particular silliness and dumbness is in service of. It trades on the Joseph Campbellian flattened idea that all myths boil down to the same light side, dark side duality. But worse, and more importantly to me, it smuggles in an idea that runs counter to what Trek, to me, personally, has historically stood for. Here, the evil Vesta are representative of some vaguely defined primordial evil force. Compare that to Babylon 5's Shadows, which were also an ancient eldritch threat, but one that explicitly within the show represented the ideology of might makes right. The same logic that underpins imperialism, colonialism, and fascism, all systems that Babylon 5 was explicitly dealing with.
The others, the ones who live here, believe that strength only comes from conflict. They want to release our potential, not bottle it up.
It's really simple. You bring two sides together, they fight. A lot of them die. But those who survive are stronger, smarter, and better.
It's like knocking over an anthill. Every new generation gets stronger. The anthill gets redesigned, made better.
As a result, the Shadows were Babylon 5 pointing out the underlying ideology that lies at the heart of all of these systems of control and domination, even as each one of them has their own unique outgrowths and ways that they express themselves. That's what makes eldritch horror so powerful, when it channels human feelings of smallness in the face of systems or ideologies that seem so massive that they become incomprehensible to us on an individual level. Even H.P. Lovecraft, for all of his bigotry, used his Lovecraftian horror as a projection of his fear of the other. Strange New Worlds reduces the concept to a Saturday morning cartoon villain. The unknowable isn't tied to ideology, systems, or social fears, it's just some evil dude making smoke monsters that can be vanquished with the power of heterosexual love and the right genetics. Yes, really. Batel turns out to be the perfect person to fight this ancient evil because she has spliced genes from multiple different species that fought this ancient evil centuries, eons, or whatever ago.
And when we fight things, when we beat back the forces threatening us, we have an epigenetic response.
The way humans can sense animal predators and Vulcans can feel the coming of an earthquake.
Our biology changes in response to the threats we encounter.
What if by hybridizing me, I have somehow taken on all the adaptive characteristics of races that have faced evil? The Gorn, humans, Illyrians.
If the Vesda are an evil that predates all our known races, it is possible that all races that came later might hold some genetic memory of how to combat them.
And thanks to some timey-wimey shenanigans, we also learn that she was always supposed to be the one to imprison the Vesta for all eternity. Genetics is quite literal textual destiny here.
That I can't find some purpose, that it's eluding me. A starship captain, counselor general, none of them fit anymore. This does. The Beholder's biosignature is mine. Because I am the Sentry. I have always been effect before cause, remember? Everything that happened to me was so I could do this.
But before she fridges herself, though, she gets a vision of her perfect future that she shares with Pike. A heteronormative domestic dream where he never winds up disabled in the beepy chair, because heaven help us if we have to be disabled at any point in our life. And they have a house, a dog, a kid, and just to tick that societally appropriate progressive box, the kid also has a biracial marriage. There's no hardship to the stars here, just a nostalgic image sold to us from a Hallmark card. It's the most status quo vision of the good life imaginable, one that erases the realities and desires beyond that, the struggles of disability, messy chosen families, queerness. And then, in true good fridged woman fashion, Patel declares that love is stronger than vaguely defined evil and is frozen in time and put on a literal pedestal like all good women should be, in order to protect us with the power of her domestic love, preserve for Pike to mourn while he moves forward with his heroic destiny.
I am filled with light you cannot vanquish. I am the beholder. But I also Marie Patel. The love I feel is brighter than your darkness. Your judgment is here.
That's how the season ends. And on its own, maybe it wouldn't feel so gross, but we live under a government right now actively weaponizing rigid molds and punishing anyone who doesn't fit. So when Star Trek presents conformity to that ideal as the force that defeats true evil, and frames it as a timeless tale we're all supposed to cheer and love, after a whole season of status quo worship, conformity defending, and heteronormativity, it ends up not feeling like it's challenging power, it's propping up the status quo and norms of our society. It's Strange New Worlds insisting that there's true evil out there that we just need to punch with our love, instead of grappling with the harder truths that fascism and all systems like it, colonialism, imperialism, all the things that What Is Starfleet didn't want to look at, grows out from the very system's biases and myths about gender, race, capitalism, genetics that go unexamined. The same myths this season has spent 10 episodes regurgitating. Star Trek, to me, has never been about absolutes of good versus evil. It's always been about empathy, perspective, and challenging the stories we tell to justify oppression and otherization. Even Gene Roddenberry, for all of his many flaws, and believe me, he had many, and his self-mythologizing, articulated this beautifully. He argued that there is no true good or evil in the universe, just people and the systems we build, telling stories that justify our actions.
Evil doesn't exist. There really isn't such a thing as evil. It is our interpretations of these actions that labels them evil.
I don't always agree with Roddenberry, but on this point he was right. Yes, humans are capable of terrible things, believe me. As a trans person, I know that more than most. But believe me when I tell you that I don't think that that comes from some vague, true evil lurking in the dark, or an inherent flaw in human nature that we can never escape, that we're doomed to end up just repeating these cycles over and over and over again. It's only conformity to a system and an ideal that will protect us. What we call evil grows out of the ways we create others. The fears, the walls, the hierarchies we build to justify power and control, to push people away from us, to say, I am better than you, or at the very least, I am different from you. But the truth is, the other is part of us. What we do to others is what we do to ourselves, because we are all connected. At its best, Star Trek has always understood that. It's always been about breaking down those walls, about delighting in learning more about ourselves through others, through friendship, through trust, through kindness. Spock wrestling with his identity, Kirk and Spock balancing each other out. That's what made Star Trek inspiring, not just some aesthetic. That's why it mattered to me. And it's exactly what Strange New Worlds seems to forget, or worse, what those who own it want us to forget. What happened to risk is our business? Isn't that why we go out in a starship? Why we're aboard her in the first place? To see strange new worlds, new civilizations, new ways of being. It's right here. All you have to do is look across the table, look across at the people that you are too afraid to see as like you. I want a Star Trek that resists the expectations of today, not throwing double-fisted punches, but by daring to represent a dream of a better tomorrow that we should reach for. Something new, something braver, a Star Trek that challenges power in the present tense, that resonates with us not just as nostalgia, but as a rallying cry, that speaks directly and overtly to the world we live in, the forces shaping it, and the struggles we face right now. That's what Star Trek once dared to be. That's what it should still dare to be. But if Star Trek can be hollowed out and used as propaganda for our current political moment, if it becomes a tool to sell the lie that the future should look exactly like the present just with better technology, then maybe it's time we let it go. That would break my heart. I wouldn't want it. But I'll always have what Trek once meant to me. And maybe it's time to focus on what I can create that might mean something to someone else. Because if the Federation flag itself becomes more sacred than the values it's supposed to represent, then I believe the bravest thing we can do is burn it. Stand in defiance of empty symbols. Starfleet, the Federation, Star Trek has always been an idea, a hope, a horizon to reach for that we can never actually achieve. Not a logo to blindly follow, but something that we can still follow even as the flag, the franchise, may fall to dust. And maybe there are other institutions we should have been willing to do that with long ago. We beat fascism, imperialism, colonialism, all of it, not by punching it back and rebuilding the same systems that caused it, only to then act surprised when it somehow returns. We beat it by daring to build something better, by reaching for each other, by weaving a future worth fighting for, not because it repeats what we've known, because it's safe, but because it imagines what lies beyond it, beyond the next star, and within ourselves, woven into the threads that bind us each to each other. Threads we may tug at, fray, and tear, yet somehow always still hold. That's where the frontier has always been.
Good and evil are only patterns which make experience and growth possible. No one ever really gets hurt because all of this that happens is happening only to that same great entity. And why worry about the us, which is simply a fragment of that great consciousness?
Thank you so much to all of my patrons who help me do what I do. I adore you, and I could not do this without you. But an extra special thank you to Mock at 80, Carrie Ellen Foss, Veronica Fox, Blue, Mary Mello, Barbie Ann Rounds, Sarah Montgomery, Iron, Stephen Clenard, Christian Hurst, Jazz Miss, Jade Stark, Daniel Prone, Randy Thompson, Alex Miller, Lily Blanley, Samuel Howard, Dark Archon, Auntie Kate 808, Vincent Ellington, Tara Rose, Amada Kaiba, Miranda Ketia, Atheistic Snail, Zane Schuessler, Michael Wonetz, Super Desi, Meadow Whisperer, Joseph Dewey the Gnome, Sammy Joe Retro, Daihatchi, Chris Showers, Lily Gray, Angela Hendricks, Rose Conley, David Demma, Katie Starr, Todd Verling, Cade Kitten, Shep Alderson, Dominic Noble, Cleo McKeever, Anthony Evans, James Krivda, Brian Walters, Villager138, Farengato, Kalarina Bonbon, W. Randy Ed, Patrick Green, Kevin Frotag, Gumunder Stephenson, Sean Silver, Daryl William Sandifer, Flyan Conda, Epsilon is greater than, Ryan Hunter, Jamie, Casey Kyle Hampton, Troy Stull, L. Tantivy, Teague Wilson, John Witherby, Alexa Burris, Erica Barrica, Care On, Casual Observer, Sarah Lemero, Patrick Crompton, Crit Mullen, Jason Knott, Stephen Richardson, Hope Jason Tuliana, Sade Zerd, Zach Prax, Ing Marie, it's Craig Lowe, Penile Sparing Vaginoplasty, Grumpy Dragon 75, Stephen Chapman, Vale Hunkinen, Damian Rice, Sasha M, Pramita Bagchi, Rosalind Bennett, Melinda Walters, Melody Ann Winters Good, White Lion, Sean Piper, Juliana Rigel, Sarah Leslie Hutchkins, Sarah Bystam, Carrie the Neuroturtle, Tyler Edwards, Sophie's Dead Name Walking, Jordy Lucero, Richard Gerdurazi, Meat Popsicle, Craig and David, Luna, Laura Demeros, Celestial Dawn, Kezzy Garrett Smithinson, Alec Lay Berry, Bruno, Tori Perez, Crit Fax, Lev Goodman, Nyan Fan, Jocelyn Ethersford, Quite Bearish, Michael Weber, Mira G, Maximilian Marks, Henry Pierce, Tom Chi 311, and Julie Werner. Adore y'all. Thank you. Mwah.